began at
Hold on.
11:17 on a
I've got what
Thursday
you
night
need right
in
here.
November.
Please,
The kind of cold
hurry.
Colorado rain that turned the streets of Denver into rivers of reflected neon and made the Rocky Mountains disappear behind curtains of gray. Providence Memorial Hospital stood like a beacon against the storm, its windows glowing with the soft yellow light of fluorescent tubes and the harsh white of surgical lamps, a fortress of healing rising 14 stories above Colfax Avenue. Inside those walls, 347 patients slept or suffered or waited for morning, attended by nurses who moved like ghosts through antiseptic corridors, and doctors who made decisions that separated life from death with the casual precision of accountants balancing ledgers. Daniel Hayes walked those corridors alone. He moved through the second floor at exactly 11:23, his footsteps falling in the steady rhythm he had maintained for 1,247 nights. The count mattered to him. Each shift represented another day survived, another rent payment, earned another morning when he would pick up his daughter from the cafeteria and drive her to school and pretend that this half-life they lived was something approaching normal. His security uniform hung loose on his frame, the navy fabric faded from too many washes, the word security printed across his back in letters that had once been white but had yellowed into something closer to cream. The jacket he wore over it was older still, a relic from his previous life that he could not bring himself to discard despite the frayed cuffs and the stubborn stain near the left pocket that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The hospital knew him as Danny the Quiet One, the guy who held doors and pushed wheelchairs and brought water to anxious family members waiting for news that might destroy them. He never complained about the overnight hours or the holidays spent patrolling empty hallways while other men sat with their families. He never mentioned the nightmares that kept him awake, even on his days off, the dreams of sand and blood and screaming that transported him back to places he had sworn to forget. The other security guards thought he was strange, perhaps too reserved, too watchful, but they respected him in the way men respect those who ask nothing and give what they can. None of them knew about the tattoo on his right wrist, the number 68 inked into his skin in military precision, the designation that marked him as something more than a man who checked locks and watched surveillance monitors. None of them knew about the medal in the shoebox under his bed, the silver star that represented 23 lives saved, and one life that could never be saved, no matter how many times he replayed that night in his memory. None of them knew that Daniel Michael Hayes had once been Sergeant Hayes of the United States Army Medical Corps, that he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, that he had performed surgery under fire with nothing but a combat knife and a prayer while bullets tore the air around his head. He had buried that man with his wife 5 years ago, and he had no intention of resurrecting him. The radio on his shoulder crackled with static, and then dispatch was speaking the words cutting through the white noise with practiced urgency. Incoming trauma from a motor vehicle accident near the Broadway Bridge, estimated arrival 3 minutes, all units be advised that the emergency department was preparing for a critical patient. Daniel changed direction without conscious thought, his body responding to the familiar cadence of crisis, while his mind remained detached, observing from a distance, as it always did when the old training threatened to surface. He reached the emergency room entrance just as the ambulance sirens became audible through the rain, the wailing growing louder until the vehicle itself burst into view, lights strobing red and blue against the wet pavement. The doors crashed open and paramedics spilled out their movements, choreographed by years of practice, their voices sharp with the controlled panic that separated professionals from amateurs. On the gurney between them lay a woman perhaps 34 or 35, her designer clothing torn and soaked with blood that had already begun to darken from bright arterial red to something closer to rust. Daniel recognized her face before the paramedics finished rattling off her vital signs, before the nurses descended with their IV bags and their monitors and their desperate efficiency. Everyone in Denver knew that face. It stared out from magazine covers and television screens and the massive billboard on Interstate 25 that advertised Sterling Enterprises as the future of American technology. Victoria Sterling, the youngest self-made billionaire in Colorado history, the woman the press had dubbed the Ice Queen for her legendary composure and her ruthless business practices, the CEO who had transformed her father's struggling startup into a $12 billion empire through sheer force of will and an apparent absence of human emotion. She did not look like a queen now. She looked like a woman who was dying. The lead paramedic was shouting numbers that Daniel understood too well: blood pressure dropping, possible internal bleeding, significant blood loss from a laceration on her left arm, patient conscious but disoriented. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as nurses prepared for the worst, and someone tried to reach Dr. Morrison, the attending physician, who was apparently stuck in traffic on the rain-slicked highway. Minutes mattered in situations like this. Minutes could mean the difference between a woman who walked out of the hospital and a body that was wheeled to the morgue. Victoria's hand shot out as the gurney passed her fingers, closing around a nurse's wrist with surprising strength for someone who had lost so much blood. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper, hoarse with pain and fear, the words that followed etching themselves into Daniel's memory with the permanence of scar tissue. "Please," she breathed, a single syllable containing more vulnerability than he had ever heard from anyone not lying on a battlefield. "Just make it fast. I don't want the pain." The nurse looked around helplessly, searching for a doctor who was not there, for someone with the authority to promise this woman that her suffering would end. The seconds stretched into eternities while Victoria Sterling, titan of industry, begged a stranger for the mercy of a quick death. Daniel's feet carried him forward before his mind could object. He heard himself speaking in a voice he had not used in 5 years, the calm and commanding tone of a combat medic who had talked soldiers through amputations performed without anesthesia, who had held men's hands while they died and promised them that their families would know they had been brave. He heard himself telling the nurse to trust him, that he knew what he was doing, that there was no time to wait for authorization or protocol or any of the bureaucratic safeguards that hospitals erected between patients and the people capable of saving them. The nurse hesitated for a heartbeat that felt like an hour, and then she stepped aside. Daniel stripped off his security jacket and draped it over Victoria's trembling body, the fabric still warm from his own heat, a small comfort against the cold that was creeping into her extremities as her circulatory system began to fail. He checked her pulse with fingers that had performed this action 10,000 times, feeling the thread-rapid flutter of a heart that was working too hard to compensate for blood it no longer possessed. Her breathing was shallow and fast, her skin pale and clammy, her pupils dilated with shock and the primal terror of an animal that sensed death approaching. Victoria's eyes found his as he worked, her gaze unfocused at first, but sharpening as he applied pressure to the wound on her arm with the precise technique that came from years of practice. She saw something in his face that made her stop struggling, stop whimpering, stop begging for an end to the pain. Her eyes traveled down to his wrist, to the tattoo that his rolled-up sleeve had exposed, and something changed in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the instinctive trust that humans placed in those who radiated competence during crisis. She asked him if she was going to die, and the question carried the weight of every fear she had never allowed herself to voice, every vulnerability she had spent her adult life concealing behind walls of ice and ambition. Daniel looked into her eyes, and he gave her the same answer he had given to soldiers bleeding out in the Afghan dust, the same promise he had made to men who had no business surviving, and yet somehow did, because they believed him when he spoke. "Not tonight," he told her, his voice steady as mountain stone, certain as the turning of the earth. "You're going to see the sun come up. I promise." Something in Victoria Sterling broke at those words, some final resistance crumbling, as she allowed herself to believe this stranger in his worn security uniform, this man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much death to lie about its approach. Her fingers reached for his, trembling, seeking an anchor in the storm that threatened to sweep her away. Daniel took her hand and held it tight, feeling the desperate pressure of her grip, the way she clung to him, as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and terrifying. He talked to her while he worked, maintaining the steady stream of words that kept patients conscious and focused, that gave their minds something to grasp while their bodies fought for survival. He asked her name, and she whispered, Victoria, the syllables slurred but recognizable. He told her his name was Daniel, and that she had been in an accident, and that she was going to be fine because the doctor was on his way, and all she needed to do was keep breathing with him in and out, matching her rhythm to his voice, until the frantic pace of her respiration began to slow into something more sustainable. 7 minutes passed in this fashion. 7 minutes of Daniel Hayes being someone he had sworn never to be again. 7 minutes of muscle memory overriding conscious decision as his hands did what they had been trained to do, and his voice provided the calm that his patients needed to survive. He stabilized her blood pressure through positioning and direct pressure. He kept her warm and conscious and focused on his face rather than the spreading pool of her own blood. He monitored her vital signs through nothing but observation and experience, and the instincts that combat had burned into his nervous system. When Dr. Morrison finally burst through the emergency room doors, rain-soaked and breathless from his sprint across the parking lot, he found a scene that made him stop in his tracks. The woman on the gurney was stable, her bleeding controlled, her vital signs hovering in the zone that separated critical from catastrophic. The nurses stood in a semicircle around a man in a security uniform, their faces reflecting the same confused mixture of relief and disbelief. The doctor looked at the monitors, then at Daniel, then back at the monitors. His question emerged as equal parts accusation and admiration. "You did this?" Daniel was already stepping back, already retreating into the anonymity that had become his armor. "Just kept her steady until you got here, Doc. Nothing more than that." But Dr. Morrison had been practicing emergency medicine for 23 years, and he knew the difference between basic first aid and the skilled intervention that had kept this woman alive. He looked at Daniel with new eyes, seeing past the faded uniform and the unremarkable face to something that lay beneath. "You saved her life," the doctor stated. And it was not a question. Daniel did not respond. He never did when people said things like that. He simply watched as the medical team wheeled Victoria toward the operating room, as the controlled chaos of the emergency department resumed its normal rhythm, as the crisis passed and the night returned to its ordinary silence. Victoria turned her head as the gurney moved, her eyes searching the room until they found him standing near the door. Their gazes locked for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of ordinary time, and she mouthed two words that he could not hear, but understood perfectly. "Thank you." He nodded, a small gesture that acknowledged her gratitude without accepting it, and then he disappeared back into the corridors of Providence Memorial Hospital. Just another security guard completing his rounds, just another anonymous figure in the machinery of modern medicine. The nurses would talk about what had happened, would speculate about the quiet man who had appeared from nowhere and saved a billionaire's life. But the gossip would fade within a few days, and Daniel Hayes would return to his comfortable invisibility. That was how he preferred it. Heroes were for movies and monuments. He was just a man trying to survive until morning. The cafeteria on the first floor of Providence Memorial was a cheerless space at the best of times, all institutional lighting and vending machines and tables that had been wiped clean so many times that their surfaces had worn smooth as river stones. At midnight, it was nearly empty, populated only by a handful of nurses taking their breaks, and a few family members too anxious to go home and too exhausted to stay awake. In the corner near the window at the table she had claimed as her own, over the course of 1,247 nights, Emma Hayes sat with her homework spread before her and her colored pencils arranged in the precise order she preferred. She was 8 years old with curly brown hair that she had inherited from her mother and blue eyes that were pure Daniel Hayes. Her face held the particular concentration of a child who has learned that the world is not always kind, that good things can disappear without warning, that the people you love can be there one moment and gone the next. She worked through her math problems with methodical determination, her pencil moving across the page in strokes that were too careful for someone her age, as though she understood that mistakes had consequences and nothing could be taken for granted. Beside her homework lay a drawing she had made during the slow hours of the evening, a picture that featured a man in a blue uniform standing before a glowing red heart. The man had kind eyes and strong hands, and a smile that existed only in her imagination because her father rarely smiled these days. Not really, not the way he had smiled in the photographs from before. Before the soldiers came to their door with their careful faces and their terrible news. Before her mother stopped coming home. Before the world changed into something smaller and colder and more frightening than any place had a right to be. Rachel Chen found Emma there at 12:30, the young nurse making her usual check on the child who had become something of a mascot for the night shift staff. Rachel was 29 years old with the kind of practical beauty that came from too little sleep and too much compassion, and she had taken Emma under her wing from the first night Daniel had brought her to the hospital because no one else could watch her, and the overnight daycare center had been too expensive for a security guard's salary. Emma looked up from her drawing as Rachel approached, her small face lighting with the genuine pleasure of a child who has learned to find family wherever kindness presents itself. The nurse asked what she was creating, and Emma held up the picture with the pride of an artist displaying her masterwork. "It's my dad," she explained, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of youth. "He has a heart that shines because he helps people, even when they don't know he's helping them." Rachel studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved, noting the careful attention Emma had paid to the details of her father's uniform, the way she had drawn his hands open and reaching forward as though ready to catch anyone who might fall. The nurse had seen Daniel Hayes perform small acts of kindness dozens of times over the past years, carrying patients who could not walk, holding doors for visitors, struggling with walkers, sitting with the dying when their families could not bear to watch the end. She had never thought much about those actions, had simply accepted them as evidence that some people were wired differently than others, that some souls could not witness suffering without trying to ease it. Now, after what she had heard whispered through the emergency department grapevine, she wondered if there was more to the quiet security guard than anyone had suspected. Emma asked if her father was finished with his rounds yet, and Rachel checked her watch before answering that he should be coming by soon to check on her. The child nodded with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, to fitting her life into the spaces between her father's obligations, to making herself small and undemanding because she understood without being told that their survival depended on his ability to work, and that work meant she had to be flexible and understanding beyond her years. She returned to her drawing, adding more rays of light around the heart on her father's chest, making it brighter and warmer than anything that existed in the fluorescent reality of the hospital cafeteria. Rachel watched her for a moment, feeling something twist in her chest that might have been admiration or might have been sorrow, and then she continued on her rounds, leaving the child to her art and her vigil. Daniel appeared at 1:15, his patrol completed for the next hour, his footsteps slowing as he approached the table where his daughter waited. Emma heard him coming before she saw him, some sixth sense alerting her to his presence, and she was already smiling when he rounded the corner and came into view. The smile transformed her face from solemn to radiant, and Daniel felt the same familiar ache he experienced every time he saw his daughter's happiness, the bittersweet recognition that she looked more like Sarah with every passing month, that she was growing up without her mother, and there was nothing he could do to fill that absence, no matter how hard he tried. He asked about her homework as he slid into the chair across from her, and Emma pushed her math sheet toward him with the confident flourish of a student who knows she has done well. "All finished," she announced, and she only needed a little help with the fractions because fractions were tricky, but she figured them out eventually. Daniel reviewed her work with genuine attention, not the distracted half-focus of a parent going through the motions, but the careful examination of someone who wanted to understand exactly what his child had learned and where she might need additional support. Her answers were correct, her handwriting neat, her process clearly shown in the margins, where she had worked through each problem step by step. He told her she had done an excellent job, and the pride in his voice was not performance, but the authentic pleasure of a father watching his daughter succeed, despite every obstacle the world had placed in her path. Emma pushed the drawing toward him next, and this time there was a hint of shyness in her gesture, the vulnerability of an artist presenting work that came from somewhere deeper than skill or technique. Daniel looked at the picture, at the man with the glowing heart who was clearly meant to be him, and something in his chest constricted with an emotion he could not name. He asked her about the heart, why it was shining like that, and Emma's answer came with the simple certainty of absolute conviction. "Because that's what you do, Dad. You make things better for people, even when they don't see you doing it. Your heart shines when you help them, even if they can't see the light." Daniel reached across the table and pulled his daughter into a hug, holding her small body against his chest and breathing in the scent of her shampoo in the particular warmth that was uniquely Emma. He told her the drawing was perfect, that he would keep it forever, that she was the best artist he knew. She giggled against his shoulder, the sound of pure childish joy, and for a moment the cafeteria, with its harsh lighting and institutional sadness, transformed into something approaching sanctuary. They stayed like that for a long moment, father and daughter holding each other in the middle of the night, while the hospital hummed around them with its constant rhythm of crisis and recovery. Then Emma pulled back and asked if they could go home now, and Daniel had to tell her not yet, that he had a few more hours of work before his shift ended, that she should try to get some sleep on the couch in the break room, and he would wake her when it was time to leave. She accepted this news without complaint, as she always did, gathering her homework and her colored pencils and her precious drawing into her backpack, with the practiced efficiency of a child who had learned to carry her world with her wherever she went. Daniel walked her to the break room and settled her on the worn sofa with a blanket from the supply closet tucking the edges around her the way he had done every night for the past 4 years. She looked up at him with eyes that held trust and love, and something else, something older and sadder, that should not have existed in the face of an 8-year-old. She asked him if everything was okay, and he could hear the real question beneath the words, the fear that she carried, always the terror, that one day he too would disappear, and she would be left entirely alone. Daniel smoothed her hair back from her forehead and promised her that everything was fine, that she should sleep and dream good dreams, and he would be right there when she woke up. He had never broken a promise to her, and she knew it, and after a moment the tension in her small body relaxed as she allowed herself to believe him. He watched her drift toward sleep, her breathing deepening and slowing, her features smoothing into the peaceful mask of childhood slumber. When he was certain she would not wake, he rose and returned to his patrol, closing the door softly behind him and resuming his endless circuit of the hospital's corridors. The hours passed as they always did, minute by minute, and room by room, until the darkness beyond the windows began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Daniel completed his final round and clocked out at 6, exactly, retrieving Emma from the break room and carrying her to the car when she was too sleepy to walk. She woke enough during the drive to ask about breakfast, and he promised her pancakes, the special ones with chocolate chips that she loved, the ones he only made on days when he felt they both needed something sweet to start the morning. He never mentioned what had happened in the emergency room. Heroes did not need headlines, and Daniel Hayes had stopped believing in heroism a long time ago. The morning after nearly dying, Victoria Sterling woke to sunlight. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her private room on the top floor of Providence Memorial Hospital, painting golden rectangles on the pristine white sheets and warming her face with the gentle insistence of a new day. For a long moment, she simply lay there, feeling the warmth on her skin, watching dust motes dance in the beams, experiencing the profound and unfamiliar sensation of being alive when she had fully expected to be dead. Her body announced itself through a chorus of complaints. The wound on her arm throbbed beneath its bandages. Her ribs ached where the seatbelt had caught her during the impact. Her head felt stuffed with cotton, and her mouth tasted like copper and antiseptic. But beneath all the discomfort, overwhelming it entirely, was the sheer improbable miracle of consciousness, of breath of the heart, that continued to beat in her chest when by all rights it should have stopped. She remembered fragments from the night before: the rain-slicked road, the deer that had appeared from nowhere, the desperate twist of the steering wheel, and the sickening crunch of metal as her car left the road and began to roll. She remembered pain that eclipsed everything else, pain that made her beg for death because anything would be better than that endless agony. And she remembered a voice unwavering, as granite, promising her that she would see the morning come. "You're going to see the sun come up, I promise." She had believed him. Against all evidence, against every rational assessment of her condition, she had believed this stranger with the kind eyes and the gentle hands and the numbers tattooed on his wrist. And now here she was, watching the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains, alive because a security guard had made her a promise and kept it. The door opened and a nurse entered with the brisk efficiency that marked morning rounds, checking Victoria's vital signs and adjusting her IV and asking the standard questions about pain levels and comfort needs. Victoria answered on autopilot, her mind elsewhere, still trying to process the events of the previous night. When the nurse finished her tasks and prepared to leave, Victoria stopped her with a question that had been building since she opened her eyes. "The man who helped me last night, before the doctor arrived, who was he?" The nurse's professional mask softened into something approaching wonder. "That was Daniel," she explained. "Daniel Hayes, works night security. He kept you stable until Dr. Morrison could get here." The nurse paused, and her next words carried the weight of professional judgment accumulated over years of emergency medicine. "Honestly, Miss Sterling, the way your vitals looked when they brought you in, I don't know if you would have made it without him." Victoria absorbed this information in silence. A security guard. She had been saved by a security guard. The irony was not lost on her, though she could not quite articulate why. It felt ironic why the profession of her rescuer seemed to matter, when by all rights it should not. She asked if Daniel Hayes was still in the building, and the nurse shook her head. "Night shift ended at 6, she explained. "He's probably at home now. Gets some sleep, picks his daughter up from wherever she naps during his shifts, takes her to school. Same routine every day." The nurse left and Victoria was alone with the sunlight and her thoughts and the growing realization that she owed her life to a man she had never met before last night and might never see again. She should have been grateful. She should have been composing thank you notes in her head, planning generous gifts, thinking of ways to acknowledge the debt she owed. Instead, she found herself growing uncomfortable with the whole situation, with the implication that Victoria Sterling, master of her own fate, controller of a $12 billion empire, had been helpless and terrified and dependent on the kindness of a stranger. She had built her entire adult life on the principle of never needing anyone. She had constructed walls of ice and steel and achievement specifically to prevent moments like this. Moments of vulnerability. Moments when someone else held power over her survival. The fact that she had failed that, she had lain on that gurney begging for death, while a security guard held her hand and talked her through the darkness, felt less like salvation and more like exposure, like having her carefully constructed armor stripped away to reveal the frightened girl who still lived beneath. Jonathan Webb arrived at 9 o'clock, his arms full of work and his face full of worry. He was 32 years old, impossibly efficient, and had served as Victoria's personal assistant for the past 4 years through mergers and acquisitions and hostile takeovers and every other form of corporate warfare. He had never seen her in a hospital bed before. He had never seen her looking small and fragile and human. He began speaking as soon as he entered, a flood of information about the board's emergency meeting and the media's requests for statements and the 3-point drop in Sterling Enterprises stock that had occurred when news of the accident became public. Victoria listened with half her attention, nodding in the appropriate places, asking the occasional question that demonstrated she was still sharp despite her injuries. But beneath the surface of business as usual, she was thinking about the security guard with the tattoo on his wrist, wondering who he really was, wondering why a man who could keep someone alive through sheer force of will and skill was working overnight shifts at a hospital instead of practicing medicine somewhere that would pay him what he was clearly worth. She interrupted Jonathan's summary of the board meeting to ask him a question that had nothing to do with stock prices or media strategies. "The security guard who helped me last night," she said, her voice carefully neutral in the way it always was when she discussed something that mattered to her. "I want to know more about him." "Daniel Hayes." Jonathan's expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to puzzlement. He asked if she wanted him to arrange a meeting to facilitate some kind of formal acknowledgement, and Victoria shook her head. "Not yet," she clarified. "First, I want information. His employment record, his background, whatever you can find." If Jonathan found this request unusual, he was too well trained to show it. He simply nodded and made a note on his tablet, adding it to the endless list of tasks that would need to be completed before the day was done. Victoria spent the next several hours managing her empire from her hospital bed, conducting conference calls and reviewing documents and making decisions that affected thousands of employees and billions of dollars. It was familiar work, comfortable work, the kind of activity that allowed her to feel like herself again, rather than the terrified woman who had clung to a stranger's hand in the emergency room. By late morning, she had almost convinced herself that the previous night had been an aberration, a momentary lapse in the facade she had spent a decade constructing, nothing more than the predictable response of a human body to trauma and blood loss. Then she saw him. She had finished a call with her chief financial officer and was preparing to review the quarterly projections when movement in the corridor outside her room caught her attention. Through the glass window that separated her private suite from the hallway, she watched a man in a Navy security uniform walking past. He moved with the particular economy of someone who was accustomed to being unnoticed, neither hurrying nor dawdling, simply completing his appointed rounds with the methodical precision of long practice. It was him, Daniel Hayes, the man who had saved her life. Victoria found herself on her feet before she consciously decided to move, ignoring the protest of her injured ribs and the lightheadedness that came from standing too quickly. She grabbed the crutch the nurses had left beside her bed and made her way to the door, pushing it open just as he was about to disappear around the corner. Her voice emerged stronger than she expected, carrying clearly down the corridor, with the authority she had cultivated through years of commanding boardrooms and dominating negotiations. "Wait," she called. "You're Daniel, aren't you?" He stopped, turned. His face showed no surprise at seeing her up and moving, no indication that being hailed by a patient he had saved was anything out of the ordinary. There was only the calm, steady regard she remembered from the night before, the eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by billionaires or emergency rooms or anything else the world might throw at them. Yes, ma'am. His voice was low and even, neither deferential nor challenging, simply factual in a way that Victoria found oddly refreshing after years of people who tailored their tone to match what they thought she wanted to hear. She made her way toward him, leaning on the crutch more heavily than she would have liked, acutely aware that she looked nothing like the polished executive who appeared on magazine covers and keynote stages. Her hair was uncombed, her face free of makeup, her body wrapped in a hospital gown that did nothing to project power or authority. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the flimsy fabric. "I wanted to thank you," she managed when she reached him, the words sounding awkward and insufficient even as she spoke them. "For last night." His response came with the same economy of language that seemed to characterize everything about him. "Just doing my job, ma'am." Victoria felt her jaw tighten at the dismissal. "Your job is security, not emergency medicine." Something flickered in his eyes there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He did not dispute her observation. He simply waited, regarding her with the patience of someone who had learned that silence was often more useful than speech. Behind Victoria, Jonathan appeared in the doorway of her room, his face registering surprise and concern at finding his employer in the hallway conversing with a security guard. He approached with careful steps, positioning himself at her shoulder in the stance of a bodyguard rather than an assistant. And when he spoke, his voice was pitched low enough to create the illusion of privacy while remaining clearly audible to Daniel. "Miss Sterling, the PR team has advised that we should avoid creating any narrative around the accident. You know how the media twists things." Victoria felt herself wavering, felt the familiar pull of self-protection and reputation management that had guided her decisions for so long. She looked at Daniel, at his unremarkable uniform and his calm face and the tattoo that marked him as something more than he appeared, and she felt something inside her begin to harden, to retreat behind walls that had served her well for a decade. The words emerged before she could stop them, falling from her mouth with the practiced coldness of a CEO protecting her image. "I appreciate what you did, but I'd prefer if you kept last night between us. I don't need rumors or unnecessary attention. I'm sure you understand." She watched his face for a reaction and found none. No anger, no disappointment, no indication that her request had affected him in any way. He simply nodded, his expression remaining as placid as still water. "Wasn't planning to talk about it," he replied. The implication was clear. Unlike her, he had no interest in what others thought, no concern for how the story might be shaped or who might benefit from its telling. "Good." Victoria heard herself speaking, heard the Ice Queen voice that she wore like armor, and felt a distant disgust at her own behavior that she quickly suppressed. "I don't like owing people." Daniel looked at her, then really looked at her, and she felt something shift in the air between them. His eyes held no judgment, no accusation, no demand for gratitude or recognition. There was only a kind of sad understanding, the recognition of someone who saw through her walls and found nothing surprising in what lay beneath. "Then don't, ma'am." His voice was quiet but carried clearly, and the words that followed struck her with the force of a physical blow, landing somewhere deep in her chest where she had thought nothing could reach. "Just live better." He turned and walked away. Victoria stood frozen in the corridor, watching him disappear around the corner, feeling as though she had been stripped bare by four simple words. Jonathan was saying something about the car being ready to take her home, about the arrangements that had been made for her continued recovery, but she could not focus on his words. All she could hear was the echo of that voice, calm as still water. Just live better. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever dared to look at Victoria Sterling, the Ice Queen of Colorado's business world, and tell her that she needed to improve herself. Employees feared her, competitors despised her, journalists alternately fawned over and criticized her, but not one of them had ever simply looked into her eyes and issued a quiet challenge that assumed she was capable of being more than she was. She returned to her room in a daze, answering Jonathan's questions on autopilot, allowing the nurses to complete their discharge preparations without really seeing them. When the car finally arrived to take her back to her penthouse in the downtown high-rise that she called home, she sat in the leather-upholstered silence and stared out the rain-streaked window at the city she had conquered, and she thought about a security guard who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return except that she become a better person. The challenge would not leave her alone. It followed her up the private elevator to her penthouse through the minimalist perfection of rooms designed by the city's most expensive decorator, into the bedroom where she lay awake long past midnight, despite the exhaustion that should have pulled her under. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his hand holding hers, while she begged for death and he promised her sunrise. Just live better. She had spent 10 years building walls. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered what lay on the other side. 3 days after the accident that nearly killed Victoria, Sterling, Daniel Hayes pulled his aging pickup truck to the curb beneath the Broadway Bridge and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air carried the bite of approaching winter, cold enough to make his breath visible, but not yet cold enough to freeze the puddles that had accumulated in the potholes along the service road. He walked toward the concrete pillar that supported the bridge's massive span, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, searching for a figure he both hoped and dreaded to find. Tommy Brennan was exactly where he had expected to be, huddled against the pillar, with a sleeping bag wrapped around his shoulders and a small fire burning in a metal barrel beside him. He looked smaller than Daniel remembered, diminished by years of hard living and harder memories, his once powerful frame wasted to something gaunt and fragile. The army jacket he wore had seen better days. Its camouflage pattern faded and its patches barely visible beneath accumulated grime, but it was unmistakably military issue, unmistakably the uniform of a man who had once served his country and now lived forgotten beneath its highways. Daniel approached slowly, deliberately making noise so that Tommy would hear him coming. Surprising a veteran with untreated PTSD was never wise, especially in the early morning hours when nightmares still clung to the edges of consciousness and the line between past and present blurred into something dangerous. Tommy's head came up at the sound of footsteps, his body tensing with the instinctive readiness of a soldier preparing for threat. But when he recognized Daniel's face in the firelight, something in him crumbled. Danny. The name emerged as barely a whisper, disbelief and joy and shame all tangled together in 2 syllables. Danny Hayes. Christ, I thought you were dead. Daniel crouched beside the fire, bringing himself to Tommy's level, meeting his old friend's eyes without flinching from the pain and degradation he saw there. He asked how long Tommy had been living here, how he had ended up in this place, why he had not reached out for help. The questions were gentle but insistent, the questions of someone who needed to understand before he could begin to fix what was broken. Tommy's story emerged in fragments, scattered pieces that Daniel assembled into a picture of gradual disintegration. After the army, Tommy had struggled to adjust. The nightmares had been bad, the flashbacks worse, the drinking worst of all. His wife had tried to stand by him, had endured the midnight screaming and the unpredictable rages and the long silences that felt more terrifying than handsome, but eventually even love had limits. She had taken their son and left, moving to California to start over with someone who did not wake up fighting invisible enemies. Tommy had applied for disability benefits through the VA, had filled out the forms and attended the appointments and submitted to the evaluations that were supposed to determine whether his service had earned him the right to treatment. The answer had come back negative. Not severe enough, they had said. Functional enough to work, they had claimed. The fact that no one would hire a man who could not sit through a job interview without sweating through his shirt and checking the exits every 30 seconds had apparently not factored into their calculations. He had been living on the streets for almost 2 years now, moving from shelter to shelter when space was available, camping in places like this when it was not. He had learned where to find food and where to find relative safety, had developed the survival skills that the homeless accumulated through bitter experience, had accepted that this was his life now, and nothing would change it. Daniel listened to all of this without interruption, his face carefully neutral, even as his heart broke for the man who had once been his brother in arms. He remembered Tommy as he had been before, as the fearless sergeant who had led their squad through ambush after ambush, as the friend who had pulled Daniel back from the edge more than once when the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. Seeing him reduced to this, seeing the wreckage that war and bureaucracy had made of a good man, stirred something in Daniel that he had thought long dead. He told Tommy that he was going to help, that he would find a way to get him treatment and housing and whatever else he needed to start putting his life back together. Tommy tried to argue, tried to insist that he was beyond helping, that Daniel should not waste his time on a lost cause. Daniel cut him off with the quiet authority that had once commanded respect on battlefields. We don't leave our own behind. The words were a vow and a challenge, a reminder of the code they had both lived by in the chaos of combat. That was true in Kandahar, and it's true now. You're my brother, Tommy. I'm not abandoning you. Tommy's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away that leaked down his weathered cheeks despite his best efforts to contain them. He reached out and gripped Daniel's arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging in as though Daniel were a lifeline and Tommy was drowning. There's something I have to tell you, Tommy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that Daniel had to lean closer to hear. About the night Sarah died. I know something, Danny. Something I should have told you years ago. Daniel felt his blood run cold. Sarah, his wife. The woman he had loved more than his own life, more than his career, more than anything the world had ever offered him. She had been dead for 5 years, taken from him in a car accident that had shattered his existence and left him holding the pieces of a family that would never be whole again. For 5 years, he had carried the guilt of not being there, of sleeping peacefully while she drove through the rain toward a death he could not prevent. For 5 years, he had told himself that if only he had been awake, if only he had answered his phone, if only he had been the husband she deserved, she might still be alive. What do you mean? His own voice sounded strange in his ears, distant and hollow, as though it belonged to someone else. What could you possibly know about that night? Tommy's face contorted with anguish, with the weight of a secret that had been eating him alive for half a decade. The story that emerged was halting and broken, punctuated by and apologies and the desperate plea for forgiveness that Daniel was not sure he could grant. On the night Sarah died, Tommy had been drunk. He had been spiraling for months, self-medicating with alcohol because the VA had denied his disability claim and he could not afford the medications that might have helped. He had wanted to talk to someone, anyone, someone who understood what he was going through, and in his inebriated state, he had grabbed his phone and dialed what he thought was Daniel's number. His fingers had fumbled, transposing digits, and the call had gone to Sarah instead. She had answered because she was expecting Daniel to call because he often checked in during his shifts, because the phone had shown a number she did not recognize, and she had been worried it might be important. Tommy had not realized his mistake. He had poured out his anguish in slurred, rambling monologues, talking about the war and the nightmares and the voices that told him to end everything. Sarah good. Sarah compassionate. Sarah who had never been able to ignore someone in pain, had tried to calm him down, had tried to figure out where he was so she could send help. She had gotten in her car and driven into the rain, searching for a man she had never met, trying to save a stranger because that was simply who she was. The roads had been slick, visibility poor, and somewhere along the way she had lost control, and her car had left the road, and by the time the paramedics found her, it was too late. The confession hung in the cold air between them, terrible and complete. Tommy waited for the blow that he clearly expected, the explosion of rage that would be perfectly justified given what he had revealed. Daniel sat motionless, feeling as though the ground beneath him had opened up and swallowed everything he thought he knew about the worst night of his life. For 5 years, he had blamed himself. For 5 years, he had lived with the conviction that his absence, his failure to be there, had cost Sarah her life. Now he learned that it was not his fault at all that his wife had died because of a wrong number and a bottle of whiskey and the relentless compassion that had made her the woman he loved. The rage came inevitable and overwhelming, rising in his chest like a wave that threatened to drown everything in its path. He wanted to hit Tommy, wanted to beat him bloody for stealing 5 years of peace, for letting Daniel carry a burden that should have been shared. His hands clenched into fists and his vision narrowed, and for a moment he was not in Denver at all, but back in Kandahar, back in the chaos of combat, where violence was the only language that made sense. Then he saw Tommy's face, saw the devastation written there, saw a man who had clearly been punishing himself for 5 years with far more cruelty than Daniel could ever inflict. Tommy was broken, destroyed not by external forces, but by his own conscience, by the knowledge of what his weakness had cost and the inability to make it right. Sarah would not have wanted this. The thought cut through the rage like a blade of ice, clear and cold and undeniable. Sarah who had driven into the rain to help a stranger. Sarah who had always believed in redemption. Sarah who had loved Daniel precisely because he was capable of mercy even when mercy was hard. She would not have wanted him to destroy what remained of Tommy Brennan over a mistake that no amount of violence could undo. Daniel unclenched his fists. He drew a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. He looked at the wreckage of his old friend and made a choice that cost him something he could not name. His words came slowly, each one requiring effort, each one a deliberate rejection of the fury that still churned beneath the surface. I don't forgive you because you deserve it. I forgive you because I can't carry the hate anymore, because Sarah wouldn't want me to, because my daughter needs me whole, not broken by bitterness. Tommy stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language, as though forgiveness was a concept so alien that it could not be processed. The tears flowed freely now, years of guilt and shame pouring out in a flood that left him shaking and gasping. Daniel reached out and gripped his old friend's shoulder, feeling the bones too prominent beneath the skin, the tremors that came from a body pushed past its limits. "You're going to get help," he said, and his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had once commanded men on battlefields. "We're going to figure this out together. But first, you need to get off the street." He helped Tommy to his feet, gathered the meager possessions that represented everything the man owned in the world, and led him toward the truck. The sun was beginning to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful against the gray concrete of the bridge. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Daniel noted the symmetry. He had promised Victoria Sterling that she would see the sunrise, and she had. Now he was watching another sunrise with another person he was trying to save, and he wondered if this was simply what his life had become, a series of daybreaks, witnessed in the company of the damaged and the lost. The thought did not disturb him as much as it might have. Perhaps this was his purpose. Perhaps this was what remained after the war, and the grief had stripped everything else away. He could not change the past, could not bring Sarah back, could not undo the choices that had led Tommy to that bottle on that night. But he could face the morning. He could put one foot in front of the other. He could keep moving forward, carrying whoever needed carrying until there was no one left to save. It was not much of a philosophy, but it was enough to get him through another day. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Lincoln Elementary School, casting long shadows across the playground, where Emma Hayes sat on a swing, her feet dragging in the wood chips below her eyes, fixed on something in the middle distance that only she could see. The other children had formed their groups and started their games, the complex social hierarchies of third grade, establishing themselves through kickball teams and jump rope circles and the thousand small negotiations that children conducted without adult supervision. Emma remained apart, not quite excluded, but not quite included, either occupying the borderland reserved for those who did not fit neatly into any category. She heard the footsteps approaching before she saw the figure, the click of expensive heels on concrete that sounded wrong against the backdrop of sneakers and playground noise. When she looked up, a woman was standing at the edge of the playground, watching her with an intensity that made Emma's stomach tighten with unease. The woman was old, at least 60, with gray hair styled in the severe bob that Emma associated with the mean grandmother in a movie she had seen once. Her clothes were nice, nicer than anything Emma owned, and her face wore an expression that seemed friendly on the surface but felt wrong underneath, like a smile painted over something harder. "Emma." The woman's voice carried across the distance between them, warm and familiar, in a way that did not match the stranger's face. "Don't you remember me, sweetheart? I'm your grandmother. Your mother's mother." The swing stopped moving. Emma gripped the chains tighter, her knuckles whitening her body, responding to danger before her mind could articulate why she felt threatened. She did remember this woman, remembered her from before, from the time when her mother was still alive, and would sometimes take Emma to visit the big house in the suburbs where everything was clean and cold, and Emma was not allowed to touch anything. Grandma Maggie. The name emerged reluctantly, pulled from memories that Emma had tried to bury along with everything else from before. "What are you doing here?" Maggie Hayes moved closer, her smile never wavering, her eyes never quite matching the warmth of her expression. "I came to see you, darling. I've been worried about you. I heard about how you've been living, sleeping in hospitals while your father works, never having a proper home. It's not right for a little girl." Emma felt something hard and protective rising in her chest, an instinct to defend that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "My dad takes care of me. We're fine." "Are you?" Maggie's voice dripped with concern that felt manufactured, artificial, like the sweetness of diet soda that left a strange aftertaste. "Because from what I've heard, your father has some problems, sweetheart. Problems from the war. Problems that make it hard for him to take care of you the way you deserve." The words struck Emma like physical blows, each one landing on fears she had never admitted even to herself. She had seen her father wake up screaming, Sometimes had heard him moving through their small apartment at night when he should have been sleeping, had noticed the way his eyes went distant sometimes, as though he was seeing something far away and terrible. But he was still her dad, still the person who made her pancakes and helped with her homework and told her stories and kept her safe. He was still everything. That's not true. Emma's voice came out smaller than she wanted, younger than she felt. My dad is a good person. Maggie knelt down, bringing herself to Emma's eye level, and for a moment her mask slipped enough that Emma could see something underneath, something desperate and hungry that had nothing to do with grandmotherly love. Your mother was my daughter, she said, and there was real pain in her voice now, real grief that twisted her features into something almost pitiable. I lost her and I can't lose you too. I just want what's best for you, Emma. Don't you want to live in a nice house, have your own room? Go to a better school. Emma thought about the apartment she shared with her father, the small rooms and the old furniture, and the way the heating sometimes made strange noises in the winter. She thought about the cafeteria at the hospital, the uncomfortable couch in the break room, the nights spent waiting for her father to finish his shift. It was not a lot by anyone's standards. It was not the life that most children had, but it was her life, and her father was in it. I want to stay with my dad. The words came out firm and clear, surprising Emma herself with their conviction. Maggie's face changed, the mask slipping further, revealing frustration and determination, and something that looked almost like anger. We'll see about that, sweetheart. Maggie straightened up, smoothing her expensive coat with hands that trembled slightly. You may not understand this now, but I'm doing this for your own good. Someday you'll thank me. She walked away before Emma could respond, her heels clicking against the concrete with a sound that felt like warning. Emma watched her go, feeling sick in a way that had nothing to do with physical illness. And when the bell rang to signal the end of recess, she had to force herself to move, to walk back to class on legs that felt wooden and strange. She did not tell her father what had happened when he picked her up that afternoon. She did not mention to the grandmother who had appeared like a storm cloud and left threats hanging in the air. But that night, when Daniel tucked her in and smoothed her hair back and promised that everything was going to be okay, she held on to him tighter than usual, and she did not let go until sleep finally claimed her. Some fears were too big to name. Some dangers were too close to acknowledge. Emma Hayes was 8 years old, and she understood more about the precariousness of her world than any child should have to. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to the address Daniel had listed on his employment forms. It bore the seal of the Denver County Court System and the recurring address of a law firm that Daniel had never heard of. And when he opened it, his hands began to shake with a tremor that had nothing to do with his old injuries. Notice of legal proceedings, child custody. The words blurred before his eyes, the careful legal language swimming in and out of focus as his mind struggled to process what he was reading. Petitioner Margaret Elizabeth Hayes. Respondent Daniel Michael Hayes. Subject, minor child Emma Grace Hayes. Grounds: unsuitable living environment, financial instability, concerns regarding mental health of custodial parent. Daniel read the document 3 times each pass, revealing new details that twisted the knife deeper into his gut. Maggie had hired an expensive law firm, had documented his work schedule, and their living conditions, had somehow obtained information about his PTSD diagnosis and his sessions with the VA counselors. She was painting a picture of a broken man, a damaged veteran, barely holding himself together, an unfit father whose devotion to his daughter was outweighed by his inability to provide the stable environment she deserved. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. He had 21 days to find a lawyer he could not afford, to gather evidence he did not know how to obtain, to somehow convince a judge that love and dedication counted for more than income level and psychological history. 21 days to fight for the only thing in his life that still mattered. He thought about calling in sick to work, about spending the day researching custody law and making phone calls and doing whatever it took to start building his defense. But the bills would not pay themselves, and missing a shift would mean less money for the lawyer he would somehow have to hire, and Emma needed to see him functioning normally, because any sign of instability would only make things worse. So he went to work. He walked the corridors of Providence Memorial Hospital with the legal papers in his pocket, their weight far heavier than the few ounces of paper could account for. He checked doors and monitored cameras and helped an elderly patient find the cafeteria, and all the while his mind raced through scenarios and strategies and the terrible possibility that he might actually lose. Rachel Chen found him in the break room during his lunch hour, staring at the documents with an expression that made her stop in the doorway. She asked if everything was okay, and Daniel looked up at her with eyes that held more fear than she had ever seen in them. He told her about Maggie, about the custody petition, about the looming court date. Rachel listened with growing horror, her own face paling as she understood the magnitude of what he was facing. When he finished, she sat down across from him and spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who has decided to take action. There has to be something we can do, someone who can help. She pulled out her phone and began searching, scrolling through results, her brow furrowing with concentration. Legal aid societies, pro bono lawyers, anything that might give Daniel a fighting chance against his well-funded opponent. Daniel appreciated her effort, appreciated the care behind it, but he had already done the math. Legal aid had waiting lists months long. Pro bono lawyers were overwhelmed with cases. The kind of representation he would need to go up against Maggie's high-powered attorneys would cost more than he made in a year. More than he could borrow, more than he could possibly scrape together in 3 weeks. He was going to lose. The realization settled over him like a shroud, cold and heavy and suffocating. He was going to lose. Emma was going to watch his daughter be taken away to live with a woman who saw him as a failure, and a threat was going to become one of those fathers who got supervised visits on alternate weekends while someone else raised his child. The thought was more than he could bear. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt the pull of the darkness that had almost claimed him in those first terrible months of grief. The voice that whispered that nothing mattered, that everything was pointless, that the world would be better off without him. He had fought that voice for Emma's sake, had clawed his way back to something resembling life because she needed him. But if she was going to be taken away anyway, if his presence in her life was going to be reduced to occasional visits under the watchful eyes of court-appointed supervisors, then what was the point of any of it? He pushed the thought away with an effort that felt physical, a wrenching of his mind away from the abyss. He was not going to give up. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in his body and time on the clock. He would fight, would exhaust every option, would burn himself to ash if necessary to keep his daughter. But first he had to get through his shift. First he had to walk the corridors and check the doors and pretend that his world was not crumbling around him. First he had to be Daniel Hayes Knight, security guard, the man who held everything together through sheer force of will, because falling apart was not an option he could afford. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching into eternity, each minute weighted with the knowledge of what was coming. When his shift finally ended and he collected Emma from the break room, she looked up at him with those clear blue eyes that missed nothing, and she asked if he was okay. He lied to her. He smiled and told her he was just tired, just looking forward to their pancake breakfast, just happy to be going home with his best girl. She accepted the lie because she wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate, and they drove through the morning streets in a silence that felt fragile as spun glass. At home, Daniel made the pancakes he had promised, chocolate chip ones with extra whipped cream, and he watched Emma eat with the fierce attention of a man memorizing every detail against the possibility of loss. Her laugh, her smile, the way she got chocolate on her nose and giggled when he wiped it off. The small, perfect moments that made up a life that could be stolen by a court order and a grandmother's determination. When she left for school, he sat alone in the kitchen and allowed himself 5 minutes of despair. 5 minutes to feel the weight of it all, the unfairness, the impossibility of his situation. Then he stood up, washed the dishes, and started making phone calls. He was not going to go down without a fight. He owed Sarah that much. He owed Emma everything. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Sterling Tower, 40 stories above the streets of Denver, a monument to success and isolation rendered in glass and steel and minimalist design. Victoria had lived here for 5 years, ever since the company's initial public offering had made her wealthy enough to buy anything she wanted, and in all that time she had never once questioned whether what she wanted was worth having. Now sitting in her home office with the city spread out below her like a circuit board of lights and shadows, she found herself questioning everything. The folder on her desk contained the results of Jonathan's investigation into Daniel Hayes, the information she had requested from her hospital bed 3 days ago. She had been putting off reading it, finding excuses to attend to other business, but the folder sat there like an accusation demanding her attention. She opened it and began to read. Name Daniel Michael Hayes. age 38. Current position, night security guard, Providence Memorial Hospital, Denver, Colorado. Previous employment, United States Army Medical Corps, 2009 to 2019. The military records filled most of the folder pages and pages of service history and performance evaluations and commendations. Victoria read through them with growing disbelief, watching a picture emerge that bore no resemblance to the quiet man in the faded uniform she had met in the hospital corridor. 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, multiple deployments to Kandahar province during the height of combat operations, hundreds of field medical interventions, documented casualties, treated lives saved under conditions that the reports described in dry military language, but which Victoria's imagination painted in vivid and terrible colors. And then the incident that had made him a hero. August 2017, a routine patrol ambushed in the Arghandab Valley. 12 vehicles hit by coordinated IED strikes and small arms fire. Sergeant Hayes, serving as the squad's combat medic, had responded by doing the impossible. The citation for his Silver Star described how he had moved through enemy fire 7 separate times to reach wounded soldiers, how he had performed field surgery with improvised equipment while bullets struck the ground around him, how he had refused evacuation until every wounded man had been extracted. 23 lives saved. His own body wounded in 4 places, injuries he had ignored until the last patient was loaded onto the medevac helicopter and his adrenaline finally gave out. Victoria turned to the newspaper clippings that Jonathan had included, articles from the Denver Post and the Army Times and the New Yorker Times, all telling the same story with varying degrees of dramatic embellishment. Kandahar hero saves 23 comrades. Medic's courage under fire earns Silver Star. Sergeant Hayes hailed as battlefield angel. The photos showed a younger Daniel, clean-shaven and sharp-eyed in his dress uniform, medals bright against the dark fabric. He looked different from the man she knew, more present, somehow more alive. The photographs from after his wife's death showed the change, the way grief had hollowed out something essential, leaving behind a man who was still technically alive, but no longer fully inhabiting his own existence. She read about Sarah Hayes, learned about the accident that had killed her, about Daniel's decision to leave the Army and take a job that would let him be present for his daughter. She learned about Emma, the 8-year-old girl who did her homework in hospital cafeterias and drew pictures of her father with glowing hearts on his chest. She learned about the security guard wage that barely covered rent, about the PTSD diagnosis that Daniel had fought through with therapy and determination, about the quiet life he had built from the wreckage of his old one. And she thought about how she had treated him, the dismissal, the request for silence, the "I don't like owing people" spoken with the coldness of a woman who had forgotten what it meant to be human. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about a call with Asian markets, and Victoria silenced it without looking. For the first time in her professional life, work could wait. Something more important demanded her attention. She called Jonathan and told him to clear her afternoon schedule. Then she did something she had not done since her father's heart first began to fail. She drove to see him. Robert Sterling lived in the house where Victoria had grown up, a sprawling estate in Cherry Hills Village that had once felt like a palace and now felt like a hospice. The nurses who attended him around the clock greeted Victoria with the careful smiles of people accustomed to delivering bad news, and she walked through hallways filled with memories of a childhood that seemed to belong to someone else. Her father was awake when she entered his bedroom, propped against pillows, his once powerful frame wasted to something fragile and bird-boned. The machines around him beeped their steady rhythms, counting out the seconds of a life that had almost run its course. Victoria, his voice was thin but clearer still, carrying traces of the authority that had built an empire. "I wasn't expecting you today." She sat in the chair beside his bed and took his hand, feeling how cold it was, how the skin stretched over bones that had seemed too prominent. "I needed to talk to you," she said, and her voice cracked in a way she would not have permitted herself a week ago. "About something important." She told him about Daniel Hayes, about the accident, about how he had saved her life, about how she had discovered who he really was. She told him about her shame at how she had treated him, about her confusion over why a decorated hero would be working a minimum wage job instead of practicing the medicine he had clearly mastered. She told him about the way Daniel had looked at her when she asked him to keep quiet, about the 4 words that had been echoing in her mind ever since. "Just live better." Robert listened in silence, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Let me tell you a story," he said, "about why I built Sterling Enterprises. about why I started the foundation, about something that happened to me 40 years ago when I was younger than you are now. Victoria leaned forward, sensing that she was about to learn something crucial, something her father had kept hidden throughout her entire life. In 1982, Robert had been 28 years old, fresh out of business school, and convinced that the world owed him success. He had been driving home from a job interview, his head full of plans and ambitions, when a tire blew on the highway and sent his car rolling down an embankment. He had been trapped in the wreckage, gasoline leaking from a ruptured fuel line, the smell of it filling his nostrils as he struggled against the crushed metal that pinned his legs. A man had appeared from nowhere. Robert never learned his name, never saw his face clearly through the smoke and the blood that blurred his vision. The stranger had smashed the window with his bare hands, had torn the door from its hinges with strength that seemed impossible, had dragged Robert from the car seconds before the leaking fuel ignited and the entire vehicle disappeared in a ball of flame. And then he had vanished. No name, no address, no way for Robert to find him and thank him. Just a life saved and a mystery that had haunted Robert for 4 decades. I spent years trying to find him. Robert said, his voice heavy with the weight of old regret. Hired detectives, offered rewards, did everything I could think of, never found a trace. So I made a promise to myself. If I couldn't repay the man who saved me, I would spend my life trying to be worthy of what he did. I would help others the way he helped me. I would pay the debt forward because I could never pay it back. Victoria understood then why her father had founded the Sterling Foundation, why he had always insisted on charitable giving, even when board members complained about the impact on profits. It was not about tax benefits or public relations or any of the cynical motivations that people assumed. It was about a debt that could never be discharged, a gift that could only be acknowledged through imitation. But I made mistakes, Robert continued, and his voice grew heavier still. I got so focused on building the company, on accumulating the resources that I thought I needed to do good, that I forgot to actually do good along the way. I taught you to be strong, Victoria. I should have taught you to be kind. Victoria felt tears threatening, felt the sting of them behind her eyes, and for once she did not fight them. They spilled down her cheeks in silent streams, washing away some portion of the ice that had accumulated over a decade of carefully maintained coldness. The man who saved you, Robert said, Daniel Hayes, he's your chance to do what I couldn't, to find the person who saved your life and thank them properly, to be worthy of the gift you were given. She stayed with her father until he fell asleep, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall, with the labored breathing of a body that had nearly exhausted itself. When she finally left, driving back toward the city, with the mountains turning pink in the sunset behind her, she felt something shifting in her chest. Tectonic plates of emotion moving in ways they had not moved since she had first learned to armor herself against the world. She had spent 10 years becoming the Ice Queen. Cold, efficient, untouchable. It had served her well in business, had earned her the respect and fear that she had mistaken for success. But it had also left her alone in a penthouse that felt more like a prison than a home, surrounded by people who worked for her but did not know her, admired for achievements that felt increasingly hollow. Just live better. Daniel Hayes had spoken those words without expectation or agenda. He had not been trying to change her or manipulate her or gain anything for himself. He had simply looked at her with those eyes that had seen too much and told her a truth that everyone else was too afraid to speak. She was not living well. She was merely surviving, accumulating wealth and power and influence, while something essential withered inside her from neglect. She had convinced herself that success was enough, that achievement was sufficient, that the loneliness was simply the price of greatness. She had been wrong. As she pulled into the parking garage of Sterling Tower, Victoria made a decision. She was going to find Daniel Hayes. She was going to learn everything about his situation. And she was going to help him, not because she owed him or because she wanted something in return, but because helping was what her father had spent his life trying to do and what she had spent her life failing to understand. It was time to start living better. The night before Thanksgiving, Providence Memorial Hospital hummed with the particular energy that preceded holidays, a mixture of urgency and melancholy that affected everyone from the nurses who would miss family dinners to the patients who would spend the celebration in sterile rooms far from home. Daniel walked his usual rounds through corridors decorated with paper turkeys and construction paper pilgrim hats, reminders of a normalcy that felt impossibly distant from the fluorescent reality of his life. Emma had fallen asleep early tonight, exhausted from a school day filled with holiday-themed activities and the barely suppressed excitement of a 4-day weekend. She lay curled on the break room couch with her blanket pulled up to her chin and her expression peaceful in a way that Daniel treasured, knowing how rare such peace had become since the custody papers arrived. He checked on her every half hour, standing in the doorway and watching her breathe, committing the sight to memory against the possibility that these simple moments would soon be taken from him. The court date loomed 2 weeks away, and despite his efforts to find affordable legal representation, he remained without counsel, without a strategy, without anything resembling hope. The radio on his shoulder crackled with a noise complaint from the third floor, and Daniel tore himself away from his daughter's sleeping form to investigate. He found the source easily enough, a frightened patient with dementia who had become convinced that enemies were outside his window, and Daniel spent 20 minutes sitting with the old man, talking him down from his terror with the same measured voice he had once used on soldiers in shock. When the patient finally settled, Daniel checked his watch and saw that he needed to complete his round of the parking garage before the shift change. He rode the elevator down to the basement level and stepped out into the concrete cavern where the hospital's visitors left their cars, the space mostly empty at this hour but still requiring inspection. The woman was waiting for him near his truck, leaning against the hood with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Victoria Sterling, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater that probably cost more than Daniel made in a month, looking nothing like the polished executive from the magazine covers. He stopped walking when he saw her, maintaining the distance between them, his posture shifting into the subtle readiness that combat had trained into his reflexes. She had sought him out deliberately, had waited for him in a place where they would be alone, and he did not know what to make of her presence. Miss Sterling. His voice carried no inflection, no indication of whether her appearance pleased or disturbed him. "Can I help you with something?" Victoria pushed away from the truck and walked toward him. Her steps measured, her eyes fixed on his face. She stopped when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice, close enough that he could see the traces of fatigue beneath the careful makeup, evidence of sleepless nights that mirrored his own. "I read your file," she said. "Military records, service, history, everything I could find. I know about Kandahar, about the 23 men you saved, about what you did over there." Daniel's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a guardedness that rose like a shield against inspection. "That was a long time ago, but it's still who you are." Victoria's voice held a certainty that surprised them both. "You saved those soldiers the same way you saved me. The same instinct, the same skill, the same refusal to let people die when you could prevent it. You didn't stop being a hero when you took off the uniform." "I'm not a hero, Miss Sterling." The words came out flat and hard, carrying the weight of conviction. "Heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I'm just a guy who got lucky." Victoria felt tears threatening again, felt the pressure building behind her eyes, and this time she did not try to stop them. They slid down her cheeks as she spoke, her voice cracking with the emotion she had spent a decade suppressing. "My father told me something today about why he built his company, why he started the foundation. Someone saved his life 40 years ago, and he's spent every day since trying to be worthy of that, trying to pay forward a debt he can never repay." She paused, gathering herself, pushing through the vulnerability that every instinct told her to hide. "I want to do the same thing. I want to help you, Daniel. Not because I owe you, but because it's the right thing to do. Because you deserve better than this." She gestured at the parking garage, at his worn uniform, at the life of midnight shifts in hospital cafeterias, in poverty that his heroism had been rewarded with. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, reading something there that made him pause. The tears were real. The emotion was real. Whatever game she might be playing, the woman standing before him was not the ice queen that the newspapers described. "I heard about the custody case." Victoria's voice softened, became almost gentle. "Margaret Hayes hired my company's law firm to represent her. That's how I found out." Daniel felt the color drain from his face. The coincidence was too precise, too cruel. His enemy's weapon came from the woman who claimed to want to help him. "I didn't know until yesterday. I made them drop the case immediately." Victoria pressed on before he could respond. "They're no longer representing her, and I want to help you fight this. Let me pay for your lawyer." Let me make sure you have the resources you need to keep your daughter. The offer hung in the air between them, too large to process, too significant to accept without consideration. Daniel had spent 5 years refusing help, refusing charity, refusing anything that might make him beholden to someone else's generosity. He had rebuilt his life on the foundation of self-sufficiency, had convinced himself that needing nothing was the same as wanting nothing. But this was not about him. This was about Emma, about keeping her safe, keeping her with him, protecting the only family he had left. He asked why. The single word contained all his suspicion, all his doubt, all the defensive walls he had constructed against a world that had taken too much from him already. Victoria's answer came without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the polished rhetoric she deployed in boardrooms and negotiations. Because you told me to live better, and this is what living better looks like. Helping people who deserve to be helped, being there for someone who needs it, doing the right thing even when there's no benefit to me. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to him. This is the best family law attorney in Colorado. Call him tomorrow. His retainer is already paid. Daniel looked at the card but did not take it. If I accept this, I'll owe you. No, Victoria shook her head firmly. You saved my life, twice if you count keeping me sane in that emergency room. This isn't a debt. This is me finally starting to pay forward what I've received. Take the help, Daniel. Fight for your daughter. And if you want to repay me someday, repay me by continuing to be the person you already are. She placed the card on the hood of his truck and stepped back, giving him space, giving him the choice that she sensed he needed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The parking garage was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional sound of a car passing on the street above. Then Daniel reached out and picked up the card, turning it over in his fingers, reading the name printed there. He looked at Victoria with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been wariness, or might have been the first fragile stirrings of trust. His voice when he spoke was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of a decision made. Thank you. 2 words. Simple. Insufficient. But they were a beginning. Victoria nodded, accepted them, and began to walk toward the elevator that would take her back to the surface. She paused before pressing the call button, turning back to look at him one more time. Happy Thanksgiving, Daniel. Call that lawyer and give Emma a hug from someone who understands what it's like to grow up without a mother. She disappeared into the elevator, leaving Daniel standing alone in the garage with a business card in his hand and a feeling in his chest that he could not quite identify. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the first crack in the armor he had worn for so long that he had forgotten what lay beneath. He walked back into the hospital and up to the break room where his daughter slept. He sat down in the chair beside the couch and watched her breathe, counting the rises and falls of her chest, marking each one as a gift he had not earned but had been given anyway. Tomorrow he would call the lawyer. Tomorrow he would begin to fight. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, he sat with his daughter and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The sun rose over the Rocky Mountains at 7:14 on Thanksgiving morning, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed too beautiful for the world Daniel knew. He stood at the window of his small apartment, watching the light spread across the city, feeling the warmth of it on his face through the cold glass. Emma was still asleep in her bed, worn out from the late night and the emotional toll of the past weeks. He had carried her up from the car and tucked her in without waking her, had stood over her bed for a long time just watching her sleep, memorizing every detail of her face against the possibility of loss. But that possibility felt different now, more distant, less inevitable. He looked at the business card still clutched in his hand, at the name of the attorney who might save his family, at the physical evidence of a kindness he had not expected from a woman he had written off as incapable of kindness. Victoria Sterling had surprised him, had humbled him in a way, had proven that the categories he sorted people into were not as fixed as he had believed. The court date was still coming. The fight was still ahead. But for the first time since the papers arrived, Daniel allowed himself to feel something other than despair. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sun continue its slow climb above the mountains. In a few hours, he and Emma would have their Thanksgiving dinner, just the two of them, a modest celebration of a life that looked small from the outside, but contained everything he valued. They would eat turkey from the grocery store and mashed potatoes from a box and pie that Rachel Chen had baked and insisted they take, and they would say what they were thankful for, and Daniel would mean every word. He was thankful for his daughter, for her laughter and her drawings and her fierce loyalty, for the way she looked at him like he was something special even when he felt like nothing. He was thankful for the people who had shown him kindness, Rachel and the other nurses who watched over Emma during his shifts, Tommy, who was now staying at a veterans shelter that Daniel had found, getting the help he had needed for so long, Victoria Sterling, who had turned out to be human after all, and he was thankful for the sunrise, for the simple fact that he was still here to see it, still breathing, still fighting, still present in a world that had tried its best to break him and failed. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled from sleep. She asked if it was really Thanksgiving, and Daniel smiled and told her it was. She patted across the floor and climbed into his lap, snuggling against his chest with the easy trust of a child who has not yet learned that the world can take everything away. He held her and watched the sun finish rising, feeling the warmth of her small body against his breathing, in the scent of her shampoo and her sleep-warm skin. This was what he was fighting for. This moment repeated over and over for as many mornings as he was granted. This was everything. One day. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety each day, bringing Daniel closer to the court date that would determine whether he kept his daughter or lost her to a woman who blamed him for her own grief. The attorney Victoria had retained turned out to be everything his reputation promised: a sharp-minded strategist named William Carter, who had built his career on winning impossible cases, and who approached Daniel's situation with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. Carter's office occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, all-glass walls and leather furniture, and the kind of understated elegance that whispered of fees Daniel could never have afforded on his own. Their first meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Carter extracted every relevant detail of Daniel's life, with the precision of a surgeon building a picture of a father who had sacrificed everything for his daughter and deserved to keep her. The lawyer's assessment was cautiously optimistic. Margaret Hayes had money and determination, but she lacked evidence of actual harm to Emma. The fact that Daniel worked nights and Emma sometimes slept in the hospital was unconventional, but not illegal. Not neglectful, not grounds for removing a child from a loving parent. The PTSD diagnosis was more concerning, but Daniel's consistent treatment and his spotless record since leaving the military would work in his favor. Carter believed they could win, provided they presented the right narrative to the right judge. Daniel left that meeting feeling lighter than he had in weeks, though the weight never fully lifted. Victory was possible, but not certain. Everything depended on performance, on perception, on convincing a stranger in a black robe that love and dedication mattered more than income and conventional living arrangements. He threw himself into preparation with the same focus he had once brought to combat: medicine gathering, character witnesses, and documentation, and anything else that might strengthen his case. Rachel Chen agreed to testify about his reliability and his devotion to Emma. The nurses and doctors who had watched him care for his daughter over 4 years offered written statements attesting to his character. Even Tommy Brennan, now 3 weeks into his recovery at the veterans shelter, provided a letter describing the man Daniel had been in Afghanistan and the brother he remained today. Victoria Sterling's involvement remained invisible to everyone except Daniel and Carter, her fingerprints carefully wiped from every aspect of the case. She had insisted on this anonymity, had made clear that she wanted no credit and no recognition, that her help was given freely and without strings. Daniel accepted this condition because he had no choice, and because, against his better judgment, he was beginning to believe that she meant it. They met twice more during those weeks, brief conversations in the hospital parking garage that felt like dispatches from a world he did not understand. Victoria updated him on her own battles, the pressure she was receiving from board members who questioned her new focus on veterans support programs, the political enemies she was making by asking uncomfortable questions about VA funding. She spoke of these challenges with a lightness that did not quite hide the steel beneath the determination of a woman who had decided to change and would not be deterred by opposition. Daniel found himself looking forward to these meetings more than he wanted to admit. Victoria Sterling was nothing like the woman he had expected her to be, nothing like the ice queen the newspapers described. She was sharp and curious and unexpectedly funny, capable of laughing at herself in ways that seemed impossible for someone of her wealth and status. She asked questions about his military service that demonstrated genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity, and she listened to his answers with the focused attention of someone who wanted to understand rather than simply to know. He told himself that the connection he felt was gratitude, nothing more. She was helping him keep his daughter, and any warmth he experienced in her presence was simply the natural response to unexpected kindness. But late at night, in the quiet hours of his shifts, when the hospital corridors stretched empty before him, he found himself thinking about the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the sound of her laugh echoing in the concrete garage, the vulnerability she allowed him to see beneath her polished surface. These thoughts felt like betrayal. Sarah had been dead for 5 years, but she was still his wife, still the woman he had loved more than his own life. The idea of feeling anything for someone else seemed wrong, impossible, a violation of everything he had promised when he slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger and vowed to love her until death parted them. Death had parted them. That was the cruelty of it. She was gone and he was still here, still breathing, still capable of feelings he had thought buried with her. The guilt of survival compounded the guilt of attraction, creating a weight that pressed against his chest in moments when his guard was down. He pushed these thoughts away and focused on what mattered. Emma, the court case, the fight to keep his family intact. Everything else was distraction, and distraction was a luxury he could not afford. The Sterling Foundation's annual Winter Gala took place on the second Saturday of December, a glittering affair that transformed the grand ballroom of the Brown Palace Hotel into a wonderland of crystal and candlelight. Victoria had debated whether to attend, had almost convinced herself that missing 1 year would not matter, but in the end, duty won over reluctance. The foundation was her responsibility, now her father's legacy, that she had inherited along with his expectations, and abandoning it even temporarily felt like abandonment of him. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, shaking hands and making small talk, and accepting congratulations on the foundation's recent initiatives with a smile that almost reached her eyes. The room was filled with Denver's elite politicians and business leaders and society figures who wrote large checks and expected recognition in return. Victoria knew most of them by name and none of them as people, their faces blurring together into a single composite image of privilege and self-interest. Her mind kept drifting to other things. To her father, whose condition had worsened dramatically over the past week, who now spent more hours asleep than awake, and whose doctors spoke in the careful euphemisms that preceded the end. To Daniel Hayes, who would face a judge in 9 days and whose entire future hung on the outcome of a hearing that should never have been necessary. To the woman she had been before the accident and the woman she was becoming now, the distance between them growing with each passing day. She was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne she did not want when the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then the room plunged into darkness, broken only by the emergency exits glowing red at the corners. Chaos erupted immediately. Voices rose in confusion and alarm. Bodies pressed together as people tried to move toward exits they could barely see. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman screamed, and the sound triggered a cascade of panic that threatened to turn the elegant gathering into a stampede. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, a crash followed by a cry of genuine distress. Someone had fallen. Someone was hurt. Victoria pushed toward the sound, fighting against the current of bodies moving in the opposite direction. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness enough to make out shapes, and she saw a cluster of people gathering around a figure on the ground. An older man, perhaps 70, his face visible in the glow of someone's phone flashlight, his lips turning blue as he clutched his chest. The man's wife was kneeling beside him, her voice high with terror as she called his name. People stood in a circle, frozen by the helplessness that gripped ordinary citizens, in the presence of medical emergency, waiting for someone with authority to tell them what to do. A figure pushed through the crowd, moving with purpose, radiating a competence that made the bystanders step back instinctively. Victoria recognized him before her conscious mind caught up with her eyes. Daniel Hayes, dressed in the uniform of a security guard hired for the event, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man with the focused stillness of a surgeon mid-operation. She watched him work, watched his hands move with precision as he checked the man's airway and pulse, watched him begin chest compressions with the rhythmic certainty of training burned into muscle memory. His voice carried clearly through the darkness, calling for someone to get the AED, instructing another person to call 911, and clear a path for the paramedics, issuing commands with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis. The emergency lights flickered on after what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, bathing the scene in harsh fluorescent glow. Victoria could see Daniel's face now, the concentration etched into every line, the way his entire being focused on the task of keeping another human alive. He was not thinking about himself, about his problems, about anything except the stranger beneath his hands, whose heart had stopped and needed to start again. The AED arrived delivered by a breathless hotel employee. Daniel attached the pads with practiced efficiency, waited for the machine to analyze, administered the shock that made the man's body jerk against the marble floor. Then he resumed compressions, counting out loud, his voice never wavering despite the exertion. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The ancient rhythm of CPR unchanged for decades, the bridge between death and survival that depended entirely on the willingness of strangers to trauma him. On the third cycle, the man coughed. His eyes fluttered. Color began to return to his face, the terrible blue fading to something approaching pink. Daniel stopped compressions and checked for a pulse, finding one weak but present, a heart that had remembered how to beat. The paramedics arrived moments later, rushing in with their equipment and their expertise, taking over from Daniel with the smooth efficiency of professionals. He stepped back, dissolving into the ordinary, once more becoming anonymous again, now that the crisis had passed. But Victoria had seen. The whole room had seen. Hundreds of Denver's most influential citizens had watched a security guard save a man's life with nothing but his hands and his knowledge, in his refusal to let death win. The whispers started immediately spreading through the crowd like ripples from a stone. Who was that? Did you see what he did? Someone said, he's a veteran. Someone else said he's the one who saved Victoria Sterling. Victoria watched Daniel disappear through a service door, retreating from the attention he clearly did not want, and she felt something shift in her chest. Pride, perhaps, or admiration, or something deeper that she was not ready to name. This man kept saving lives. It was simply what he did, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the dawn. The world threw crisis at him, and he responded with competence and courage, never seeking recognition, never asking for reward. She excused herself from the gala and followed him. She found him in a service corridor, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed and his breath coming in deep, controlled rhythms. The adrenaline was wearing off. She recognized the crash that followed, crisis revealing itself in the slight tremor of his hands and the pallor beneath his tan. He opened his eyes when he heard her approach, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded showed in his face before the familiar mask slipped back into place. You followed me. Not a question. I wanted to make sure you were okay. I'm fine. The automatic response of a man who never admitted weakness. Victoria moved closer, close enough to see the sweat that dampened his hairline, the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. You just saved another life, in front of half the city. People are going to want to know who you are. Daniel's jaw tightened. I was hoping to avoid that. I know. She reached out, almost touched his arm, stopped herself at the last moment. But maybe it's time to stop avoiding. Maybe it's time for people to see what you are. And what am I? The question came out bitter, carrying the weight of years of anonymity, years of choosing invisibility over recognition. Victoria thought about how to answer, thought about all the ways she could describe the man standing before her. Hero, soldier, father, survivor. None of them seemed adequate. You're the person everyone wishes they could be, she said finally. The one who runs toward danger instead of away from it. The one who saves people without thinking about whether they deserve to be saved. Her voice drop became almost a whisper. You're the person I'm trying to become. Daniel looked at her, then really looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged. A recognition, perhaps. An understanding. The beginning of a connection that transcended gratitude and obligation, and all the careful categories they had constructed to explain their involvement in each other's lives. The door at the end of the corridor opened and Jonathan Webb appeared, his face tight with concern. Miss Sterling, your father's nurse just called. You need to come immediately. The words fell like stones into still water. Victoria's face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks as the meaning registered. She looked at Daniel one last time, and an apology in her eyes for the conversation cut short, and then she was moving, running toward the exit in the car that would take her to her father's side. Daniel watched her go, feeling the absence of her presence like a physical thing, and then he returned to his duties because that was what he did. That was who he was. That was the only response he knew to a world that kept demanding more than he had to give. Robert Sterling died at 3:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning with his daughter holding his hand and the first gray light of dawn beginning to show through the windows of his bedroom. Victoria had arrived in time to hear his final words, had leaned close as his voice faded to a whisper, had felt his fingers tighten briefly around hers before the grip went slack and the monitors began their mournful alarm. He had talked about the man who saved him in those last hours, had repeated the story he had told her weeks before, adding details he had never shared, painting a picture of a moment that had defined his entire life. The stranger who appeared from nowhere. The impossible strength that tore a car door from its hinges. The warmth of hands pulling him to safety seconds before the flames consumed everything. Find the ones who need saving, Robert had whispered, his voice barely audible. That's the only thing that matters in the end. Not the money, not the company, the people. Promise me, Victoria. Promise me you'll save the ones you can. She had promised, had sworn it on everything she held sacred, knowing that the vow would change the course of her life, knowing that she was committing to something larger than herself. Robert had smiled then, a peaceful expression that smoothed the lines of pain from his face. He had looked for a moment like the young man he must have been before time and responsibility and illness had worn him down. Your mother would be proud of you, he said, and so am I. Those were his last words. Moments later, he was gone. The funeral took place 3 days later, a massive affair that filled the cathedral and spilled out onto the streets. Hundreds of mourners gathered to honor a man who had built an empire and never forgotten where he came from. Victoria delivered the eulogy herself, standing at the podium in black silk and pearls, speaking about her father with a rawness that surprised everyone who had known the Ice Queen. She talked about his principles, his integrity, his unwavering belief that success was meaningless without service. She talked about the stranger who had saved his life and the debt he had spent 40 years trying to repay. She talked about his final request, the promise she had made to continue his mission of helping those who needed it most. The reading of the will came 2 days after the funeral, a formal affair in the conference room of the family's attorneys. Victoria sat alone at the long table surrounded by lawyers whose faces revealed nothing, waiting to learn what her father had decided about his legacy. Most of the estate passed to her as expected, the house and the personal assets and the controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises. But the final section of the will contained a surprise that made Victoria's breath catch in her throat. Robert had restructured the Sterling Foundation, had rewritten its charter, in the weeks before his death had redirected 60% of its endowment toward a new mission. The money would no longer fund galas and awareness campaigns and the kind of charitable work that generated good press without changing lives. Instead, it would support direct services for veterans, for the homeless, for anyone who had fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to protect them. There was also a letter sealed in an envelope with Victoria's name written in her father's shaky hand. She opened it alone in the car on the way back to her penthouse, reading by the gray light of a winter afternoon. The letter was not long, but every word carried weight. Victoria, my darling girl, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're facing the future alone. I wish I could have prepared you better for what's to come, but some lessons can only be learned through living them. The man who saved you, Daniel Hayes, he's the same kind of person who saved me all those years ago. Someone who helps without expecting anything in return, who gives without counting the cost. People like that are rare, and they're precious, and they often end up alone because the world doesn't know what to do with them. Don't let him be alone, Victoria. Don't let him disappear into anonymity the way my rescuer did. Find a way to honor what he is while respecting who he is. Show the world that heroism exists in places they never thought to look. And remember what I told you. Find the ones who need saving. That's your legacy now. That's what all the money and power and influence is for. Not to accumulate more, but to help those who have nothing. I love you. I'm proud of you. Go save someone. Dad. Victoria read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, feeling her father's presence in every word, even as his absence opened like a wound in her chest. He had given her more than wealth and a company and a foundation. He had given her a mission, a purpose, a reason to become something better than she had been. She thought about Daniel, about the court case that loomed 6 days away, about the custody hearing that would determine whether he kept his daughter. She thought about the gala, about watching him save yet another life, about the way the crowd had whispered and wondered and wanted to know more. An idea began to form, taking shape slowly as the car moved through the winter streets. A way to honor her father's request and help Daniel at the same time. A way to show the world who he really was without exposing him to the kind of attention he dreaded. She pulled out her phone and began making calls. The press conference was scheduled for 3 days before Daniel's court date, held in the lobby of Sterling Tower, with cameras from every major news outlet in Colorado. Victoria had not told Daniel what she was planning, had not asked his permission or sought his input. She knew he would refuse if given the chance, would retreat into his comfortable anonymity and let the world continue believing he was nobody special. She could not allow that. Not after everything, not after her father's letter. The reporters gathered with the eager anticipation of wolves scenting blood, expecting a statement about Sterling Enterprises' future following Robert Sterling's death. They got something very different. Victoria stood at the podium dressed in a simple gray suit that would have looked ordinary on anyone else, her face composed in the expression of calm determination she had learned from her father. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I have an announcement to make, but it's not about the company, it's about something more important." She told them about the accident, about lying on the gurney in the emergency room begging for death, certain that her life was ending, about the man who appeared from nowhere and saved her with nothing but his hands and his knowledge, and his refusal to let her die. She told them about Daniel Hayes, about his military service, his 3 tours in Afghanistan, the 23 lives he had saved at Kandahar, about his Silver Star and his Purple Heart and the other medals gathering dust in a shoebox, about the wife he had lost and the daughter he was raising alone, working night shifts as a security guard, because it let him be present for the child who needed him. She told them about the gala, about watching him save another life in front of hundreds of witnesses, about the pattern she would finally recognize, the heroism that kept expressing itself despite his best efforts to remain invisible. "Daniel Hayes is the kind of person this world needs more of," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotion that pressed against her chest. "He's the kind of person we should be celebrating, not ignoring. He saved my life. He's saved dozens of lives, and he's never asked for recognition or reward." She looked directly into the cameras, knowing that Daniel would see this, knowing that he would probably be angry, hoping that he would eventually understand. "I was too blind to see it at first, too caught up in my own image and my own comfort to recognize what was standing right in front of me. But I see it now, and I want the world to see it too." The questions came in a flood, reporters shouting over each other to be heard. Victoria answered them with the patience of someone who had made her decision and would not be swayed. Yes, she knew that Daniel had not sought this attention. No, she had not consulted him before making the announcement. Yes, she understood that her actions might anger him. No, she did not regret it. "Sometimes people need to be pushed into the light," she said. "Sometimes the world needs to see its heroes, even if the heroes themselves would rather stay hidden." Daniel Hayes has spent 5 years being invisible. Today that ends. The press conference generated exactly the response Victoria had anticipated. Within hours, Daniel's face was on every news channel, his story spreading across social media with the viral intensity of something that touched a collective nerve. Kandahar hero saves billionaire. Security guard secret past revealed. The quiet hero who never stopped serving. The narrative took on a life of its own, fed by Victoria's carefully crafted revelations and the public's hunger for stories of genuine goodness in a world that often seemed devoid of it. People shared the articles, and the clips added their own commentary, expressed outrage that someone so deserving had been living in near poverty while the country he had served turned its back. The timing, Victoria knew, was not accidental. In 3 days, Daniel would face a judge who would decide whether he deserved to keep his daughter. That judge would make the decision in a vacuum of public attention, or that judge would make it knowing that the whole country was watching, knowing that any ruling against Daniel would be scrutinized and debated and potentially challenged. It was manipulation, Victoria acknowledged. It was using her power and her platform to influence an outcome that should have been decided on merit alone. But Daniel deserved to win on merit, and the system that should have recognized this had failed him. If pushing him into the spotlight was what it took to ensure justice, then she would push without apology. She only hoped he would forgive her. Daniel watched the press conference alone, standing in the break room of Providence Memorial Hospital, with his coffee growing cold in his hands. Emma was at school, thankfully spared from witnessing her father's life being dissected on national television. Rachel Chen had found him there, had tried to offer comfort, had eventually left when it became clear that he needed solitude to process what was happening. He should have been angry. Part of him was angry, the part that had carefully constructed a life of anonymity and now watched that construction being demolished by a woman who had decided she knew better than he did what he needed. But another part of him, a part he had not acknowledged until this moment, felt something very different. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude, or the strange lightness that came from finally putting down a weight he had carried so long that he had forgotten it was there. For 5 years he had hidden, had convinced himself that invisibility was a choice, that he preferred the shadows, that the attention and recognition he avoided would only make his life harder. But the truth he could admit now that Victoria had forced his hand, was that hiding had been easier than facing what he had lost. Sarah would have hated this version of him. The thought struck with the force of revelation. She would have hated the way he had retreated from life, the way he had reduced himself to something small and safe, the way he had stopped reaching for anything beyond survival. She had fallen in love with a man who ran toward danger, who helped without hesitation, who believed that he could make a difference. She would not recognize the ghost he had become. Maybe Victoria was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe Emma deserved a father who stood in the light instead of lurking in shadows. The court date was 3 days away. Whatever happened there would determine the shape of his future. But whatever happened, he realized it would not happen in silence. The world was watching now, and there was no going back. He finished his coffee, now completely cold, and went to complete his rounds. The corridors of Providence Memorial stretched before him, familiar as his own heartbeat, but somehow different now. The same walls and floors and fluorescent lights, but seen through eyes that had begun to imagine a different kind of life. 3 more days, and then everything would change one way or another. The Denver County Courthouse rose against a gray December sky, its stone facade weathered by decades of Colorado winters, its windows reflecting the pale morning light, with the indifference of institutions that had witnessed every variation of human drama and remained unmoved by any of them. Daniel arrived at 8:30, an hour before his hearing was scheduled to begin, dressed in the same suit he had worn to Sarah's funeral because it was the only suit he owned, and because some part of him recognized the symmetry of wearing the clothes of one ending to face another. Emma was not with him. The court had recommended that children not attend custody hearings, sparing them the trauma of watching adults argue over their futures as though they were property to be divided rather than people to be protected. She was at school, blissfully unaware that this morning would determine whether she continued living with her father or was handed over to a grandmother who saw Daniel as an obstacle to be removed. William Carter met him in the lobby, impeccable in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's truck, his briefcase bulging with the evidence they had assembled over the past weeks. The attorney's face revealed nothing of his own assessment of their chances maintaining the professional neutrality that served clients better than false optimism or premature despair. They reviewed the strategy one final time as they walked toward the courtroom. Carter would present Daniel's character witnesses, first establishing a foundation of community support before Maggie's attorney could paint the picture of an unstable veteran, unfit for parenthood. Then they would address the living situation, directly reframing the hospital cafeteria, not as evidence of neglect, but as proof of Daniel's commitment to remaining present in his daughter's life, despite the constraints of his work schedule. Finally, if necessary, they would introduce Daniel's military record, demonstrating that the same qualities that had made him a hero on the battlefield made him an exceptional father in peacetime. The courtroom was smaller than Daniel had expected, more intimate, with none of the grandeur that television had taught him to associate with legal proceedings. Wooden benches lined the gallery, mostly empty at this early hour, and the judge's bench loomed at the front like an altar awaiting sacrifice. Margaret Hayes was already seated at the opposing counsel's table, her spine rigid with determination, her eyes fixed forward as though refusing to acknowledge Daniel's existence might somehow strengthen her case. Daniel took his seat beside Carter and tried to slow his racing heart. The past week had been overwhelming, a flood of attention and recognition that he had never sought and still did not want. Victoria's press conference had transformed him from anonymous security guard to national news story, his face appearing on morning shows and evening broadcasts, his military service dissected by commentators who had never worn a uniform. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand. Reporters camped outside his apartment building. The hospital had been forced to hire additional security just to manage the visitors who showed up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Kandahar hero. He hated all of it. Hated the loss of privacy, the performative gratitude, the way people looked at him now, as though he were a symbol rather than a person. But he could not deny that the attention had changed. Something had shifted the ground beneath the custody battle in ways that might work in his favor. The judge assigned to his case had certainly seen the coverage. Everyone had seen the coverage. And while judicial decisions were supposed to be made on evidence and law rather than public opinion, judges were human beings who lived in the same world as everyone else. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Patricia Hernandez entered through a door behind the bench. She was perhaps 60 years old with silver hair, pulled back severely, and eyes that had clearly seen too much to be impressed by anything. She took her seat, reviewed the documents before her, and began the hearing with the practiced efficiency of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar proceedings. Maggie's attorney spoke first, presenting the case for removing Emma from Daniel's custody with the polished rhetoric of someone accustomed to winning. He painted a picture of a child deprived of stability, shuttled between apartments and hospital break rooms, raised by a father whose psychological wounds made him incapable of providing the consistent care she deserved. He cited statistics about children of veterans with PTSD, quoted experts on the importance of routine and permanence in childhood development, constructed an argument that was technically accurate in its individual claims while being fundamentally dishonest in its overall implication. Daniel listened with his hands clenched beneath the table, fighting the urge to stand up and shout that none of this captured the truth of his relationship with Emma, the love that bound them together, the sacrifices he made every day to ensure she knew she was valued and protected. But Carter had warned him about this, had explained that emotional outbursts only hurt defendants in family court, that the best thing he could do was remain calm and trust the process. When it was Carter's turn, he approached the task with surgical precision. He called Rachel Chen to the stand first, and she testified about the hundreds of nights she had watched Daniel care for Emma in the hospital, the patience and tenderness he displayed even when exhausted from his shift, the way Emma's face lit up whenever her father appeared. She described the drawings Emma made, the stories she told about her dad, the obvious bond between parent and child that anyone with eyes could see. Other witnesses followed, each adding another piece to the mosaic of Daniel's character. A teacher who spoke about Emma's exceptional adjustment despite her unconventional living situation. A doctor who had observed Daniel's interactions with patients and families, noting his natural compassion and steadiness under pressure. A VA counselor who testified that Daniel's PTSD was well managed, that he had never shown any signs of the instability Maggie's attorney had implied. Then Carter introduced the military records, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The documents told a story that transcended the narrow concerns of custody law, painting a picture of a man who had risked his life repeatedly to save others, who had demonstrated courage and competence under conditions that would have broken most people. The Silver Star citation was read aloud, its dry military language, somehow more powerful than any emotional appeal, describing actions that defied belief and yet had been witnessed and verified and officially recognized. Judge Hernandez listened to all of this with an expression that revealed nothing, taking occasional notes, asking clarifying questions that gave no indication of her leanings. Daniel watched her face for any sign of sympathy or skepticism, finding neither understanding that this woman had perfected the art of inscrutability through years of practice. The morning stretched toward noon, and then something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened, and Victoria Sterling walked in. She moved down the center aisle with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, dressed in a simple black dress that managed to convey both mourning and authority. Every head in the room turned to watch her, including Judge Hernandez, whose carefully maintained neutrality cracked for just a moment into something that might have been surprise. Victoria approached the bench and requested permission to testify as a character witness for the respondent. Maggie's attorney objected, immediately arguing that this was an obvious attempt to influence the proceedings through celebrity rather than relevant testimony. Carter countered that Victoria had direct personal knowledge of Daniel's character, having been saved by him, and that her testimony was therefore entirely appropriate. Judge Hernandez considered for a moment, then allowed it. Victoria took the stand. She spoke without notes, her voice steady despite the emotion that flickered behind her eyes. She described the night of her accident, the terror she had felt, the certainty that she was dying. She described Daniel's appearance, his calm competence, the way he had held her hand and promised her sunrise and made her believe him against all evidence. She described learning about his background, discovering that the man who had saved her was a decorated war hero living in poverty because he had chosen his daughter over his career. Her testimony was not legally necessary. Carter had already established Daniel's character through conventional means, but it was powerful in a way that transcended legal strategy, putting a human face on the abstract qualities the other witnesses had described. Here was a woman who had everything the world valued: wealth and power and status, and she was sitting in a witness box declaring that Daniel Hayes was one of the best people she had ever known. When Victoria finished, she looked at Daniel for the first time since entering the courtroom. Something passed between them, acknowledgement and gratitude, and something else that neither of them was ready to name. Then she stepped down and took a seat in the gallery, remaining to watch the rest of the proceedings. The final witness was unexpected. Maggie's attorney had called no rebuttal witnesses, apparently confident that his initial presentation had been sufficient. But Judge Hernandez exercised her prerogative to call a witness of her own, requesting that Margaret Hayes take the stand. Maggie approached the witness box with visible reluctance, her earlier certainty replaced by something that looked almost like fear. The judge's questions were gentle but probing, exploring not the legal arguments but the human motivations beneath them. Why did she want custody of Emma? What did she hope to provide that Daniel could not? What was her relationship with her granddaughter actually like? The answers that emerged were painful to hear. Maggie spoke about losing Sarah, about the grief that had consumed her, about the desperate need to hold on to something of her daughter that still lived. She admitted that she blamed Daniel for Sarah's death, that she had convinced herself his PTSD and his night shifts and his failures as a husband had somehow contributed to the accident. She confessed that taking Emma had become in her mind a way of rescuing her granddaughter from a fate similar to her daughter's. But as she spoke, something shifted in her voice. The certainty that had carried her through months of legal preparation began to crumble, replaced by the raw uncertainty of someone confronting truths they had long avoided. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and what she saw seemed to pierce through the narrative she had constructed. This man had loved her daughter. This man had devoted his life to her granddaughter. This man was not the villain she had needed him to be, but simply another person broken by loss and trying to survive. The confession that followed was not legally required, but it came anyway, pulled from some deep place that Maggie had kept locked for 5 years. She admitted that she had been wrong. Wrong to blame Daniel, wrong to pursue this custody case, wrong to let her grief metastasize into something that threatened to destroy another family. The courtroom fell silent as Maggie turned to face Daniel directly. Her voice trembled, but did not break. Sarah loved you. I knew that even when I was pretending I didn't. And Emma loves you. Anyone can see it. I've been so focused on my own pain that I forgot what actually matters, which is that little girl and what's best for her. She paused, gathering herself for what came next. I'm withdrawing my petition. Emma belongs with her father. That's where Sarah would want her to be. The aftermath of Maggie's withdrawal was anticlimactic in the way that real life often is after moments of high drama. Judge Hernandez accepted the withdrawal, made some remarks about the importance of family cooperation, and closed the case with a few strikes of her gavel. Daniel remained at the counsel table for several minutes after everyone else had left, processing what had just happened, allowing himself to believe that Emma was safe. Carter shook his hand and offered congratulations with the professional warmth of an attorney who had just won a case he genuinely cared about. Victoria approached more hesitantly, uncertain of her welcome after the press conference that had upended Daniel's life. She apologized for not telling him what she had planned, for making decisions about his story without his consent. Daniel listened to her apology and then did something that surprised them both. He thanked her. The words came out rough, unpracticed, carrying the weight of emotions he had spent years learning to suppress. He thanked her for the lawyer, for the testimony, for forcing him into the light even when he had wanted to stay hidden. He thanked her for believing he was worth saving when he had stopped believing it himself. Victoria's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She had done enough crying in the past weeks for her father, for the years she had wasted being cold, for all the connections she had refused because vulnerability felt too dangerous. Now she simply accepted his gratitude and offered her own. He had saved her life twice, she reminded him. Once in the emergency room and once by showing her what it looked like to live for something beyond yourself. Whatever she had done for him was nothing compared to that. They stood in the empty courtroom, two people whose lives had collided in crisis and emerged transformed, and for a moment the future seemed to open before them like a door that had always been closed. Then Daniel's phone buzzed with a reminder that he needed to pick Emma up from school, and the moment passed and they went their separate ways. But something had changed. Both of them knew it. The story that had begun with a car accident and a security guard's steady hands was not over. It was merely beginning its next chapter. 3 months after the custody hearing, Maggie Hayes appeared at Daniel's apartment with a box in her arms. It contained Sarah's childhood photographs, her favorite books, the small treasures that a mother keeps when her child is gone. Daniel opened the door and found his mother-in-law standing on his welcome mat, looking smaller than he remembered, the rigid determination that had characterized their every interaction, now replaced by something fragile and uncertain. She was dressed simply, no expensive coat or designer accessories, just a woman in her 60s carrying the weight of grief and regret. "I want Emma to have these," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "And I want to know if I can be her grandmother. Really her grandmother. Not a threat." Daniel looked at the box, at the woman who had tried to take his daughter from him, at the pain that lived in her eyes. He thought about Sarah, about what she would want, about the kind of man she had believed him to be. He thought about Emma, who deserved to know her mother's history, who might someday want to hear stories that only Maggie could tell. He stepped aside and let her in. They sat at his small kitchen table, the box between them, and Maggie began to unpack the contents one item at a time. A photograph of Sarah at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a stuffed rabbit that Emma now kept on her own bed. A report card from 3rd grade covered in gold stars and teacher comments praising her kindness. A dried corsage from senior prom, carefully preserved in tissue paper. A journal from college filled with Sarah's distinctive handwriting documenting her hopes and fears and dreams. Maggie narrated each item with the careful attention of a curator presenting precious artifacts, and Daniel listened with growing understanding of the woman his wife had been before he knew her. He heard stories he had never known, learned details that Sarah had never shared, pieced together a picture of a childhood that explained so much about the woman he had loved. When the box was empty and the table covered with memories, Maggie looked at Daniel with an expression of pure vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything, for blaming you, for the lawsuit, for the years I spent hating you instead of grieving with you." She paused, struggling with words that clearly cost her something to speak. "You loved her. I knew that even when I was pretending I didn't. And you've been a good father to Emma, better than I gave you credit for." Daniel sat with her apology, feeling the weight of it, the genuine remorse that suffused every syllable. He thought about forgiveness, about how he had learned to offer it to Tommy, even when the hurt was still fresh, about Sarah's belief that people could change if given the chance. "Sunday dinners," he said finally, "every other week. You can teach Emma to make Sarah's favorite cookies." Maggie's face crumpled with relief, tears flowing freely now. She reached across the table and took Daniel's hand, the first voluntary contact between them in 5 years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being better than I deserved." When Emma came home from school that afternoon, she found her father and her grandmother sitting together at the kitchen table, surrounded by photographs of her mother as a little girl. Maggie was telling stories about the summer Sarah learned to ride a bike, about the Christmas she asked for a chemistry set and nearly blew up the garage, about the day she came home from college and announced that she had met the man she was going to marry. Emma listened with the rapt attention of a child discovering hidden treasure, soaking up every detail about the mother she could barely remember. And when Maggie asked if she would like to learn to make her mother's favorite chocolate chip cookies, Emma's smile was bright enough to light the room. Some wounds healed slowly, some relationships required rebuilding from the ground up. But that afternoon, in a small apartment in Denver, 3 people who had lost the same woman found a way to honor her memory by choosing connection over conflict, forgiveness over bitterness, family over solitude. Sarah would have approved. The Hayes Center for Community Healing opened on a Saturday morning in October, 1 year after the custody hearing that had changed everything. The building occupied an entire city block in downtown Denver, its glass and steel facade gleaming in the autumn sunshine, its doors ready to welcome the veterans and families and uninsured patients who had nowhere else to turn. Daniel stood on the front steps watching the crowd gather, feeling like an imposter in the suit Victoria's assistant had insisted he wear. The past year had been a whirlwind of changes that he still struggled to comprehend. The public attention following Victoria's press conference had brought opportunities he never would have sought on his own, speaking engagements and job offers, and invitations to events where his presence was valued simply because of who he was rather than what he could do. He had accepted some of these opportunities and declined others, trying to find a balance between the visibility that now seemed unavoidable and the privacy he still craved. The position at the Sterling Foundation had felt right from the moment Victoria offered it a role that combined his medical training with his desire to help veterans like himself and Tommy, who had been abandoned by the systems that should have supported them. He had been involved in planning the center from the beginning, had fought for the programs he knew would make a difference, had watched the building rise from foundation to completion with the pride of someone who had helped create something meaningful. Emma stood beside him, 10 years old now, her hand tucked into his with the easy affection of a child who had never doubted her father's love. The past year had been good for her, too, stability and growth, replacing the uncertainty that had characterized her early childhood. She had friends now, a proper bedroom, a life that did not revolve around hospital cafeterias and break room couches. But she still drew pictures of her father with glowing hearts, still believed that helping people was their family business, still looked at him like he was something special, even when he felt like nothing. Victoria took the podium to begin the dedication ceremony, her voice carrying across the crowd with the authority she had never lost, even as her heart had opened. She spoke about her father, about the stranger who had saved him 40 years ago, about the debt that could only be repaid by helping others. She spoke about the mission of the center, the services it would provide, the lives it would touch. She spoke about the man who had inspired it all, the quiet hero who had saved her life and changed her understanding of what mattered. Then she invited Daniel to the podium, and he walked up the steps on legs that felt wooden with nervousness, facing a sea of faces that expected something from him that he was not sure he could provide. He spoke simply, without the polish of someone trained in public speaking, his words carrying the weight of experience rather than rhetoric. He talked about the soldiers he had served with, the ones who came home whole, and the ones who came home broken, and the ones who did not come home at all. He talked about the failure of systems that were supposed to catch people when they felt, a bureaucratic indifference that turned heroes into homeless men sleeping under bridges. He talked about Tommy Brennan, who was sitting in the front row looking healthy and hopeful for the first time in years, who had gone from living beneath an overpass to managing the center's veteran outreach program. Every person carries scars, Daniel said, his voice growing steadier as he found his rhythm. Some you can see and some you can't. The question isn't whether we're wounded. The question is what we do with our wounds. Do we let them define us, limit us, keep us hiding in the shadows? Or do we let them teach us compassion, connection, the understanding that everyone is fighting battles we can't see? He paused, looking out at the crowd, seeing faces he recognized and faces he did not, all of them watching him with an attention that would have terrified him a year ago and now felt almost manageable. I spent 5 years being invisible. Thought that was what I wanted. Thought staying small was the same as staying safe. But someone reminded me that there are things worth being seen for, worth fighting for, worth coming out of the shadows to protect. His eyes found Victoria's in the crowd, held them for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration. Heroes aren't the people who don't get knocked down. Heroes are the people who keep getting up, who keep reaching out, who keep believing that tomorrow can be better than today, even when today is hard. Every person here has the capacity for that kind of heroism. Every person here can save someone, even if the someone they save is themselves. The applause that followed felt unearned, as applause always did, but Daniel had learned to accept it as part of the role he now occupied. He stepped back from the podium and watched Victoria return to conclude the ceremony, cutting the ribbon that officially opened the center, transforming potential into reality with a single symbolic snip. The crowd began to disperse, moving toward the open doors where tours and refreshments awaited. Victoria found her way to Daniel's side, her face flushed with the success of the morning, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. She pulled a small wooden box from her pocket and pressed it into his hands. "This is for you, from the foundation, from me." Daniel opened the box and found a medal inside, simple and beautiful, its surface engraved with words that made his breath catch. Please don't make it fast. Stay. The words Victoria had begged for in the emergency room transformed into a plea for him to remain present, to keep living, to continue being the person he had proven himself to be. Victoria's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. You told me I would see the sunrise. I've seen hundreds of sunrises since that night. Every single one because of you. Daniel looked at the medal, then at the woman who had given it to him, then at his daughter who had appeared at his side with a drawing clutched in her small hands. The drawing showed three figures standing together, a man and a woman, and a child with a heart glowing between them and the words family, written across the bottom in Emma's careful script. Some wounds never fully heal. Daniel knew this better than most, carried the scars of war and loss and years of grief that would always be part of him. But standing here on the steps of a building that would help thousands of people, surrounded by those who had become his family through choice rather than blood, he understood that healing did not require wholeness. It only required hope and connection and the willingness to keep showing up even when showing up was hard. Victoria pinned the medal to his chest with gentle hands, her fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes asking a question that her words did not voice. Daniel covered her hands with his own, answering without speaking, accepting the connection that had grown between them over months of shared purpose and mutual transformation. Later that evening, when the crowds had departed and the center stood quiet in the fading light, Victoria found Daniel on the rooftop garden, watching the sun set over the Rocky Mountains. Emma had gone home with Rachel Chen for a sleepover, giving them this rare moment of solitude. Victoria spoke softly, her words carrying the weight of a question she had been holding for months. Daniel, I know this might seem sudden, but I've been thinking. Emma needs stability. You need support. And she paused, vulnerability naked in her eyes. I need a reason to come home at night instead of hiding in my office. Daniel looked at her, at this woman who had started as a stranger and become something he had not dared to hope for. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider letting me be part of your family. Not replacing anyone, not pretending we don't both carry ghosts, just being there. For each other, for Emma. The question hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and full of possibility. Daniel thought about Sarah, about the life they had built and lost, about the years he had spent believing that his capacity for love had been buried with her. He thought about the guilt that had kept him frozen, the fear of betraying a memory by allowing himself to feel again. But Sarah had never wanted him to be frozen. Sarah had loved him precisely because he was capable of great feeling, capable of connection, capable of opening his heart even when it meant risking pain. She would not have wanted him to spend the rest of his life alone guarding a grave instead of living a life. I think Daniel said slowly that Sarah would have liked you, and I think she'd want me to stop being afraid of tomorrow. Victoria's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, bright and warm and full of promise. She stepped closer and Daniel pulled her into his arms, and they stood together on the rooftop of a building named for a quiet hero who had finally learned that being seen was not the same as being exposed, that accepting help was not the same as being weak, that loving again was not the same as forgetting. Below them, the city of Denver sparkled in the gathering dusk, thousands of lives intersecting in patterns too complex to comprehend. The Hayes Center stood ready to receive whoever needed its services, a monument to the belief that everyone deserved care, that no one should be forgotten, that the measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members. And on the rooftop above it all, two people who had saved each other in different ways stood together and watched the first stars appear, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, new sunrises to witness and new lives to touch. The story that had begun with a car accident in a security guard's steady hands was not ending. It was transforming into something larger, something that would ripple outward through the lives of everyone. The center touched everyone. Daniel inspired everyone. Victoria helped with her resources and her influence, and her newfound understanding of what truly mattered. Emma would grow up knowing that family was not just about blood, that love could be chosen as well as inherited, that the people who raised her had found each other through tragedy and built something beautiful from the wreckage. She would carry her mother's memory in the photographs Maggie had given her, in the stories her grandmother now told during their regular Sunday dinners, in the knowledge that Sarah's compassion lived on in everyone she had touched. Tommy Brennan would spend the next decade running the center's veteran outreach program, helping hundreds of men and women find their way back from the darkness that had almost claimed him. He would marry a social worker he met at a foundation event, would rebuild his relationship with his son, would prove that no one was ever truly beyond saving. Maggie Hayes would become a regular presence in Emma's life, the grandmother she had never really had the chance to be. She would make peace with her grief, would find ways to honor Sarah's memory that did not involve punishing the people Sarah had loved. She would come to see Daniel not as the man who had failed to save her daughter, but as the man who kept her daughter's love alive through his devotion to their child. And Victoria Sterling would transform the Sterling Foundation into something her father would have been proud of, an organization that actually changed lives instead of just generating positive press. She would use her influence to advocate for veterans' rights, for healthcare access, for all the causes that Daniel had opened her eyes to. She would learn that being warm did not mean being weak, that vulnerability was not the same as defeat, that the ice queen she had built herself into was far less powerful than the authentic person she was becoming. But all of that lay in the future, unwritten and uncertain and full of possibility. For now, there was only this moment, two people standing on a rooftop in Denver, watching the stars multiply across the darkening sky, feeling the warmth of connection after years of isolation, allowing themselves to believe that the best chapters of their lives were still ahead. Daniel Hayes had spent 5 years hiding from the world, convincing himself that invisibility was safety and that wanting nothing was the same as needing nothing. A car accident on a rainy November night had shattered those illusions, had forced him back into the light, had connected him to a woman whose own journey from isolation to connection mirrored his own. Now he stood on the roof of a building that bore his name, with the woman he was learning to love at his side, looking toward a future that felt full of possibility rather than threat. The scars remained, would always remain, but they no longer defined him. He was more than his wounds, more than his losses, more than the quiet security guard who had wanted nothing but to survive until morning. He was a father, a partner, a leader, a man who had learned that helping others was not separate from healing himself, but essential to it. And as the sun finished setting and the city lights came on one by one, Daniel Hayes finally understood what it meant to live better. It meant showing up even when showing up was hard. It meant reaching out even when reaching out felt dangerous. It meant believing that tomorrow could be different, that people could change, that love was worth the risk of loss. It meant being visible, being known, being willing to stand in the light and let others see who you really were. It meant being a hero, not because you sought the title, but because you could not stop yourself from trying to save whoever needed saving, including yourself. The first light of the next morning would find Daniel and Victoria still on that rooftop, wrapped in blankets they had brought up from the center's lobby, watching the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains. Just as Daniel had promised Victoria she would see that first terrible night in the emergency room. "I kept my promise," he said quietly as the sky turned gold and pink and the city below began to stir. Victoria smiled, leaning into his warmth, feeling safer than she had felt in years. "You always do," she replied. "That's who you are." And somewhere in the city, a veteran walked through the doors of the Hayes Center and found someone ready to help. A mother without insurance received the medical care her children needed. A homeless man was given a meal and a bed, and the dignity of being seen as human rather than invisible. The slow work of healing continued as it always did, one person at a time, one sunrise at a time, one act of courage at a time. This was the legacy that Daniel Hayes would leave behind. Not medals or monuments or the admiration of strangers, but the simple truth that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they refused to look away from suffering and refused to stop believing that their actions mattered. Heroes don't move on from saving. They just find new reasons to keep doing it. 1.